Welcome, weary travelers of the digital night, to another episode of At Hollow Midnight, where we embrace the curious calm of the exceptionally unexciting. If the whispers of the world keep you from slumber, perhaps the drone of tales about peculiar discomforts and antique afflictions will offer a gentle distraction. Do consider subscribing if you find yourself drawn to these meandering narratives, for there are many more nights of peculiar historical observations yet to unfold. Tonight, we delve into the peculiar history of a place where sleep itself seemed to have taken a permanent vacation, setting the stage for an event that, while undeniably odd, carried a particular brand of horror that only the truly exhausted could comprehend. This is Chapter 1, the castle's unsettling reputation. High upon a craggy promontory, where the winds whispered tales of centuries passed through gaps in ancient stone, stood Castle Blackwood. It was not a particularly grand castle, not in the way one imagines glittering spires and banners snapping proudly in the breeze. No. Blackwood was more akin to a great sprawling stone mollusk, clinging grimly to the rock face, its grey walls perpetually damp, its turrets squat and defiant against the often grey skies. Its history, as was typical for such venerable piles of masonry, was extensive, stretching back to a time when battles were fought with cumbersome swords and plumbing was a futuristic fantasy. But unlike other castles, famed for their sieges, their royal visits, or their resident specters, Blackwood possessed a far more unique and arguably more pervasive reputation. It was known, far and wide, as the Castle of 1,000 Sleepless Nights. This was not merely a poetic flourish or a fleeting rumor. Generations had passed, and the legend of Blackwood's peculiar inability to foster genuine rest had solidified into an undeniable, almost tangible truth. Visitors, even those accustomed to the rough-and-tumble comforts of medieval inns or the drafty grandeur of other noble estates, would arrive at Blackwood with a hopeful sigh, anticipating a night of respite after long journeys. And they would depart, however, invariably paler, with eyes that held the glazed, distant look of someone who had spent the long hours between dusk and dawn, staring blankly at the underside of a four-poster bed canopy, listening to the incessant drip of dampness within the walls, or the almost imperceptible groan of the ancient timbers. The legend of Blackwood's sleeplessness dated back, it was said, to its very construction. The original Lord Blackwood, a man of stern countenance and an even sterner dedication to early rising, had reportedly insisted on a castle design that maximized defensive capabilities at the expense of practically all other considerations, including comfort or any semblance of quietude. He was a man who believed sleep was a weakness, a concession to the soft whims of the body, and perhaps, in his stoic zeal, he had inadvertently imbued the very stones of his fortress with his restless spirit. Or so the story went among the less charitable peasants in the nearby village of Oakhaven, who would often spot the castle's occupants in the morning, looking rather less like rested nobility and more like a collection of particularly grumpy owls. Over the centuries, countless remedies had been attempted. There were lords who imported the finest eider-down mattresses from the Far East, only to find themselves tossing and turning upon them like agitated beavers. Ladies had filled their chambers with lavender, wormwood, and other purported sleep-inducing herbs, only to spend the night counting not sheep, but the interminable tick-tock of their own pulse in the profound, unsettling silence that would occasionally descend before being broken by a distant, unidentifiable creak. Physicians, or what passed for them in those times, had prescribed everything from warm milk laced with poppy syrup to a stern beating with a stick, the latter proving unsurprisingly to be rather counterproductive to restful repose. Nothing worked. The castle simply rejected sleep, as if it were an unwelcome guest, politely but firmly showing it the door each evening. The Blackwood family line became synonymous with perpetual mild exhaustion. Portraits of successive lords and ladies of Blackwood showed a remarkable consistency in their portrayal. Heavy-lidded eyes, faint shadows beneath them, and a subtle but persistent air of being perpetually on the verge of needing a very, very long nap. Their conversations, it was noted, often veered into the topic of sleep, or rather, the lack thereof. "Did you manage even a wink, my dear?" One might overhear a lord inquire of his lady over their morning gruel, to which the reply was almost invariably a sigh and a defeated shake of the head. It became a family trait, a genetic predisposition to chronic wakefulness, passed down from one generation to the next like a particularly inconvenient heirloom. Servants at Blackwood were a peculiar breed. They were paid exceptionally well, a necessity given the unique demands of their employment. A scullery maid might find herself scrubbing the same pot for the 6th time at 3 in the morning, simply because she could not bring herself to close her eyes. The stable master would groom the horses until their coats gleamed like polished obsidian, often in the dead of night, for his own bed offered no true solace. The castle cooks were known for their elaborate midnight snacks, not for the benefit of their lords, but for their own restless stomachs. The entire castle, in effect, became a subtly humming hive of quiet, low-energy nocturnal activity, powered by an invisible force of collective sleeplessness. One could almost feel the restless energy seeping from the very flagstones, a pervasive hum of wakefulness that prevented any deep descent into unconsciousness. The air itself felt thin, as if the oxygen had been partially replaced by a fine mist of alertness. It was not a malevolent feeling, not exactly. There were no ghostly wails or clanking chains that kept one awake, no sudden frights. It was far more insidious than that. It was the feeling of a mind that simply refused to quiet, a body that could not relax, an almost gentle yet persistent denial of the peace that sleep promised. The nights at Blackwood were long, not because time itself stretched, but because every minute was experienced, every breath drawn with a quiet, conscious awareness that grated on the nerves after an hour or two, and utterly frayed them by dawn. The concept of counting sheep here was not an exercise in relaxation. It was a desperate, futile attempt to distract the relentlessly active mind from its own inability to shut down. One might start counting sheep, then move to counting the cracks in the ceiling, then the number of times a particular beam creaked, then the number of times they turned over, then the number of times they sighed in exasperation, until the numbers became meaningless, dissolving into the gray pre-dawn light. The beds themselves in all of Blackwood Castle were regarded with a sort of weary resignation. They were grand affairs, often intricately carved, with heavy velvet curtains and mattresses stuffed with who knew what uncomfortable things that felt perfectly soft to the touch, but offered no true rest. They were more like elaborate torture devices, designed to tantalize with the epimacy of comfort while delivering only a prolonged, frustrating vigilance. People would lie in them, perfectly still, sometimes for hours, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the very subtle sounds of the castle around them, the soft rustle of ancient tapestries, the scuttling of a mouse in the wainscoting, the distant hoot of an owl, each sound amplified by the preternatural stillness of a mind straining for repose. It was said that the very springs within these beds, if they were lucky enough to possess springs, had long since lost their bounds, tired out from centuries of supporting bodies that never truly settled. They, too, seemed to hold a certain weariness, a subtle vibration of past restlessness. And so, the reputation solidified, a strange and quiet dread, not of ghouls or goblins, but of the simple, unyielding fact that within the walls of Castle Blackwood, true, deep, restorative sleep was an impossibility, a luxury afforded to every other dwelling in the land, but perpetually denied to this one. It was a peculiar burden to bear, this hereditary insomnia, and it shaped the lives of the Blackwood lineage, instilling in them a particular brand of patient, resigned exhaustion, a constant, low thrum of weary alertness that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of their existence, and indeed into the very ancient beds themselves. Chapter 2. A Nobleman's Restless Arrival. The clatter of hooves on the ancient, uneven cobbles of the castle courtyard announced the arrival of Lord Ashworth, a man whose posture, usually quite erect and imposing, had sagged considerably with the accumulated fatigue of 3 weeks on the road. Dust fine and persistent clung to his traveling cloak, to the very tips of his well-groomed beard, and he suspected to the inside of his eyelids. His eyes, normally a sharp, discerning gray, were now dulled by an exhaustion so profound it felt less like a lack of sleep, and more like a pervasive dampness in his very bones. He had ridden through sun-drenched fields, across windswept moors, and along muddy, rain-slicked tracks, enduring the incessant jolt of the saddle and the endless, monotonous rhythm of his horses. Each mile had added another layer to his weariness, until the prospect of a proper bed, a truly horizontal surface, felt like the most luxurious fantasy imaginable. His destination, Castle Blackwood, had been little more than a smudge on distant maps until now. A convenient waypoint on his journey north to broker a rather tedious treaty concerning sheep grazing rights, a matter of great import to the local wool merchants, but of almost soporific indifference to Lord Ashworth himself. He knew nothing of Blackwood's local renown, its peculiar and deeply entrenched reputation for robbing its occupants of their nightly repose. To him it was merely shelter, a promise of supper, and most ardently hoped a place to finally, truly rest. As his horse, a long-suffering bay mare named Beatrice, came to a wheezing halt, a stable boy, surprisingly nimble despite the late hour and the dim light, appeared to take her reins. Lord Ashworth dismounted with a groan that he tried to stifle into a dignified cough, his boots finding the uneven stones with a surprising lack of grace. The castle loomed above him, less a symbol of medieval might, and more a vast, craggy mound of grey stone, its silhouette jagged against the bruised twilight sky. It had a certain stoic permanence, he conceded, but none of the romantic charm often ascribed to such ancient edifices. It simply wassing undeniably and heavily. A large oak door, studded with enormous iron bolts and slightly ajar, beckoned him inward. He stepped over the threshold, and the air within shifted, becoming cooler, damper, and carrying the faint, earthy scent of ancient stone and something indefinably old, like dried leaves or forgotten dust. A few flickering torches cast long dancing shadows across the cavernous entrance hall, illuminating walls adorned with tapestries so faded that their original scenes were mere suggestions of mythical beasts and stoic knights. A figure emerged from the gloom, a gaunt, stoop-shouldered man with a sparse halo of white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the quiet, resigned weariness of centuries. This was Master Elms, the castle steward, whose perpetually heavy eyelids seemed to droop lower than was strictly natural. "Welcome, Lord Ashworth," Elms intoned, his voice a low dry rustle, like leaves skittering across a courtyard. There was no warmth in his greeting, but neither was there any overt rudeness, merely a profound lack of discernible enthusiasm. "We have been expecting you. Your chamber is prepared." Lord Ashworth, too preoccupied with the monumental effort of merely remaining upright, barely registered the steward's peculiar demeanor. He merely grunted a polite acknowledgment, his mind already conjuring images of soft pillows and the blissful oblivion of sleep. He was led through a labyrinth of echoing corridors, each one smelling faintly of dampness and the accumulated exhalations of generations of Blackwood occupants. The flagstones beneath his feet were worn smooth in places by countless footsteps, each step a subtle reminder of the castle's immense age. The light grew dimmer as they progressed, relying more on the occasional, reluctantly glowing sconce than any natural illumination. Lord Ashworth found himself navigating a series of turns and narrow staircases, his boots resonating with a hollow thump that seemed to travel unsettlingly far through the quiet stone. He observed with his half-closed eyes that the few servants they passed seemed to move with a similar languid weariness, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces bearing a shared, subtle pallor. He simply attributed it to the general air of melancholy that seemed to cling to old, isolated houses, or perhaps the effect of the evening chill. He certainly didn't consider it a sign of chronic, generational sleep deprivation. Finally, Elm stopped before a heavy, unadorned wooden door. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed it open, revealing a chamber of surprising spaciousness. "Your lordship's chamber," he announced, gesturing vaguely into the darkness within. A single rushlight flickered on a small table by the wall, casting a feeble, wavering glow. Lord Ashworth stepped inside, relief washing over him in a warm, almost dizzying wave. The room was large, perhaps larger than strictly necessary for a single traveler, but that merely added to its sense of quiet solitude. The walls were hung with thick, dark tapestries, depicting what looked like a rather somber forest scene, their colors muted by time and the perpetual dimness of the castle. A vast fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. But his gaze, ever drawn by his singular desire, immediately fell upon the bed. It was an immense four-poster, carved from dark, heavy wood that seemed to absorb what little light was in the room. Velvet curtains, a deep, faded burgundy, hung from its canopy, promising privacy and warmth. The mattress, or what he could discern of its bulk beneath a pile of thick woolen blankets, appeared remarkably plump and inviting. To his weary eyes it looked less like a piece of furniture and more like a cloud, a personal island of soft oblivion, ready to embrace him and ferry him away from the waking world. He imagined sinking into its depths, the soft yielding of the feathers or horsehair beneath him, the cool linen against his cheek, the blissful sensation of his muscles finally, truly relaxing after weeks of constant strain. It was in his current state nothing short of a sanctuary. "Supper will be brought to you shortly, if you desire it," Elm said from the doorway, his voice as devoid of inflection as before. "Or you may join the Lord and Lady Blackwood in the great hall. They retired some moments ago, but I am sure they would be pleased by your company." Lord Ashworth managed a polite, if somewhat slurred, refusal. "Thank you, Master Elms," he murmured, already unbuckling his sword belt. "But I confess, my weariness has quite outstripped my appetite. I believe I shall take my leave of the day at once." A faint, almost imperceptible twitch played at the corner of Elms's mouth, a movement that could have been a fleeting shadow or the faintest hint of an ironic smile, though Lord Ashworth, being too far gone in his quest for rest, did not notice it. "As you wish, my lord," the steward replied, his voice still a dry whisper. With a soft click, the heavy door closed, plunging the chamber into a deeper, but not absolute, darkness, leaving only the wavering glow of the single rushlight. Lord Ashworth shed his remaining clothes with an efficient haste, born of desperate exhaustion, tossing them carelessly onto a nearby chest. He felt the cold air on his skin for a moment, then with a sigh of pure, unadulterated anticipation, he pulled back the heavy covers of the enormous bed. The sheets felt cool and crisp, a welcome sensation after the dusty, cramped conditions of his journey. He slid in, his body sinking into the mattress with a satisfying, yielding sigh from the bed itself, a sound that he interpreted as a mere settling of the ancient springs, or perhaps the rustle of the straw stuffing. He pulled the thick blankets up to his chin, nestling his head into the surprisingly firm pillow. He closed his eyes, a profound sense of peace beginning to settle over him, the kind that comes only after truly arduous travel. He imagined himself drifting, floating, sinking into a deep, dreamless void. For a moment, just a moment, he felt the delicious embrace of imminent slumber. He chuckled softly to himself, a low, contented sound. Finally, he thought, finally, a proper night's sleep. He had no notion, not the slightest inkling, of the castle's quiet, pervasive curse. nor of the long, long hours that stretched ahead, each one a testament to Blackwood's unsettling reputation, a reputation that the beds themselves perhaps were soon to articulate with a most peculiar and horrifying language. His mind, lulled by the promise of rest, missed the faint, almost inaudible squeak that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the very framework of his imposing, inviting bed, a sound so subtle it might have been the settling of the castle itself, or merely the stirring of a single, ancient, unseen dust mote. Chapter 3. The first squeak in the night. Lord Ashworth burrowed deeper into the opulent, yet oddly unyielding mattress. His body, a symphony of aches and stiffness after weeks of equestrian endurance, craved the soft embrace of oblivion. The thick, slightly musty velvet curtains, drawn tight around the vast four-poster, created a cocoon of absolute darkness, broken only by the dim, persistent glow of the rushlight he had forgotten to extinguish. Its tiny flame seemed a defiant pinprick against the oppressive black, but even that, he thought, would soon succumb to the heavy weight of his eyelids. The air in the chamber was cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of old stone, and something else, something indefinably ancient. Perhaps the very breath of time itself exhaled from the castle's deep foundations. He pulled the heavy woolen blankets tighter, a satisfying scratch against his chin, and adjusted the surprisingly firm pillow beneath his head. Every muscle in his body yearned for release, for the sweet capitulation that sleep promised. He took a long, slow breath, a sigh of profound contentment that seemed to fill the vast space around him. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but rather a profound stillness, a deep quietude that allowed the subtle hum of his own weary existence to become almost audible. He could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse in his ears, the soft whoosh of blood through his veins, the almost imperceptible movement of air as he breathed. It was the kind of quiet that, ironically, felt too loud when one desperately sought slumber. His mind, usually a bustling marketplace of concerns, treaties, and the logistical nightmares of travel, was beginning to wind down, its frantic energy dissipating like smoke into the vast, dark emptiness of the chamber. He imagined himself sinking, not just into the mattress, but into the very fabric of the castle, dissolving into the ancient quietude, becoming one with the stone and the dust of ages. The thought was rather poetic, he considered, for a man so thoroughly exhausted. Just as the edges of his consciousness began to blur, just as the last stubborn thoughts of grazing rights and unruly dukes threatened to recede into the pre-sleep haze, there it was, a sound, ventuctus, almost imperceptible, a delicate, reedy squeak. It was brief, a mere whisper of friction, like a mouse drawing a single tiny bow across an even tinier violin string. It seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the structure of the bed itself, perhaps from the very wood of the frame, or a hidden spring, if such a venerable piece of furniture even possessed such modern contrivances. Lord Ashworth's eyes, which had been blissfully closing, fluttered open again, just a crack. He lay very still, listening. The profound silence reasserted itself, unbroken. He frowned slightly, a fleeting ripple across his brow. Settling of the old wooden, he thought, his internal monologue sluggish, already half submerged in the deep pool of fatigue. It's an ancient castle after all. Everything creaks and groans. He had heard countless such sounds in his travels. The timbers of old inns groaning in the night, the distant sigh of a draught through an ill-fitting window, the subtle shiver of floorboards as the very foundations of a building seemed to breathe with age. This was no different, just the voice of time, whispering through the very bones of the structure. He adjusted his position slightly, turning onto his side, drawing his knees up a little, seeking that perfect alignment of limbs that promised total relaxation. The mattress, though firm, yielded to his weight with a soft, almost reluctant sigh of its own, a sound he barely registered, interpreting it as merely the shifting of horsehair or feathers. The desire for sleep, A tangible, almost desperate craving reasserted itself, pushing aside the faint curiosity about the ephemeral sound. He closed his eyes again, willing himself into unconsciousness. His breathing deepened, becoming slower, more measured. He was almost there. He could feel the familiar pull, the gentle descent into the waiting abyss of dreams. The world, with its demands and its discomforts, was shrinking, receding into a distant, indistinct hum. The room remained utterly dark, the rushlight now little more than a distant star against the vastness of the chamber. The silence, however, felt less profound this time, as if the faint squeak had somehow, subtly, disturbed its pristine surface. He listened, not actively, but with a lingering subconscious attention. Yet, there was nothing, only the distant, almost unnoticeable drip of water somewhere far off in the castle's bowels, a sound so constant it merely became part of the background, like the slow, steady tick of a grand clock in a distant hall. He shifted again, unconsciously, a tiny adjustment of his shoulder against the pillow, seeking a fraction more comfort. And again, it happened. A second squeak, this one infinitesimally louder, infinitesimally more distinct than the first. It was still faint, still easily dismissible, but it carried a peculiar resonance, a slightly higher pitch, as if a different part of the bed's skeletal structure had expressed its ancient weariness. It was undeniably a sound of wood on wood, or perhaps metal on metal, a friction that was both subtle and, to a mind struggling for peace, slightly grating. Lord Ashworth sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation. Good heaven, he thought, with a faint flicker of dry humor. Geese, this bed so ancient it requires a nightly lament? Here he resisted the urge to open his eyes again. To acknowledge the sound too much, he felt, was to invite wakefulness. He was so close. So very, very close to sleep. He imagined the vast, sprawling wooden frame of the bed, a relic of forgotten craftsmanship, its joints loosened by centuries of slow, almost glacial movement. It was only natural, he reasoned, that such a venerable piece of furniture would utter its complaints from time to time. He himself groaned when he stood up too quickly, and he was scarcely half the age of this bed, or so he hoped. He forced his mind away from the sound, away from the bed, away from the room. He conjured images of the wide open plains he had crossed that day, the feeling of the sun on his face, the steady rhythm of Beatrice's hooves. He focused on the memory of the cool, crisp air, the vast expanse of the sky. He breathed deeply, trying to relax every single muscle, from the tension in his jaw to the very tips of his toes. He imagined his worries, his fatigue, his consciousness, flowing out of him like sand through an hourglass, emptying him until he was nothing but a vessel ready to be filled with the sweet waters of slumber. He thought of the softness of the mattress, the crispness of the sheets, the absolute quiet that shouldn't be enveloping him. For a time, there was silence, a long, beautiful, unbroken stretch of it. Lord Ashworth felt the blissful drag of sleep pulling him down, a gentle current carrying him away. His thoughts became disjointed images flickering at the edge of his inner vision. He was almost there. He could feel the edge of the precipice, the point where consciousness simply tipped over into nothingness. The memory of the squeaks had faded, mere figments of an overtired mind. He was sinking deep, deep down. Then, just as his mind prepared to surrender, just as the last threads of wakefulness began to fray, a third squeak, undeniably clearer this time, pierced the delicate membrane of his fading awareness. It was sharper, more insistent than the previous two, a distinct, almost pointed complaint from the depths of the bed. It wasn't loud, not truly, but it was perfectly audible in the profound stillness of the chamber. It was less like a groan of settling wood now, and more like a specific isolated protest. It seemed to come from directly beneath him, a small, unhappy voice rising from the very mattress upon which he lay. Lord Ashworth's eyes snapped open. He stared into the absolute darkness, his breath catching slightly. This time he did not immediately dismiss it. There was a subtle shift in the quality of the quiet after the squeak, a lingering resonance that felt different. It wasn't the sound of an old house settling. It felt more deliberate, more singular. A tiny, almost imperceptible prickle of unease stirred within him, a nascent curiosity that threatened to unravel the fragile tapestry of his impending sleep. He remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting. The silence returned, profound and heavy, but now it felt different. It felt watching, or perhaps listening. And in the darkness, the faint, persistent glow of the rushlight seemed to wink at him, almost knowingly, as if it, too, was a long-time resident of this peculiar, sleepless castle. He adjusted his weight again, perhaps too cautiously this time, just a millimeter, and held his breath, waiting for the bed's next quiet declaration. The long, long night, it seemed, was only just beginning its peculiar overture. Chapter 4. Whispers among the servants beyond the heavy self-important doors of the noble chambers in the colder, less adorned passages of Castle Blackwood. The night unfolded with a different, perhaps more intimate, kind of quiet. Here, in the servants' quarters, a collection of cramped, drafty rooms clustered around the kitchens and the laundry. The perpetual lack of sleep was not a curious legend, but a gnawing, ever-present reality. It manifested in the slow, deliberate movements of the scullery maids as they meticulously polished the same pewter tankard for the third time since dusk, in the methodical, almost hypnotic rhythm of the laundress kneading dough for her own consumption. As hunger often accompanied wakefulness, and in the distant, soft, shushing sounds of the stable-master, Barnaby, brushing down a horse in its stall, an act of comfort for both man and beast in the long, dark hours. These individuals, the silent engine of Blackwood, moved like figures in a slow-motion dream, their faces etched with a profound, almost artistic weariness. Their conversations, when they occurred at all, were hushed, economic, and often peppered with yawns that were less about tiredness and more about a resigned recognition of their ongoing, unwinnable battle with slumber. It was in this somber, yet ever so slightly active, underbelly of the castle that the first whispers began. Old Midge, the head laundress, a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by decades of Blackwood nights, paused her rhythmic kneading. Her eyes, usually fixed with unwavering intensity on the rising dough, flickered upwards towards the ceiling. A faint, thin sound, like the dry sigh of a forgotten gate, had reached her ears. It was barely audible, swallowed almost immediately by the persistent drip of a leaky tap in the scullery. But Midge heard it. She cocked her head, a slow, owl-like movement. Young Thomas, a fresh-faced kitchen boy still holding on to the last vestiges of youthful energy, looked up from meticulously scrubbing a pot. He hadn't heard it, or if he had, he dismissed it as the castle merely settling, as castles were wont to do. But Midge knew better. She had been born within these walls, her mother and grandmother before her, and she understood Blackwood sounds with the quiet intimacy of a long-term prisoner. "Did you hear that, lad?" Midge mumbled, her voice raspy from disuse. Thomas shook his head, his scrub brush continuing its tireless, circular motion. Midge merely hummed, a low, tuneless drone, and returned to her dough. But her movements were now laced with a subtle tension. The sound, she recognized, was a bed squeak, not the typical groan of ancient timbers or the shift of stone, but something specific, something internal to the sleeping chambers, a sound that always carried a particular, quiet dread. It was too early for such sounds, she mused. The noble folk had only just retired, or at least tried to. A little later, as the deep, inky blackness of true night settled over Blackwood, A low murmur began to ripple through the few servants who were still awake and moving. In the scullery, Ilara, a maid whose eyes perpetually seemed to scan the horizon for a distant, longed-for sunrise, exchanged a quick, knowing glance with old Gareth, the castle cook, who was meticulously chopping vegetables for a breakfast that was still hours away. Gareth had heard it too. A slightly louder, more insistent squeak had just resonated from somewhere above, a sound that was too distinct to be merely the wind or the groan of the old oak beams. It was the sound of bed springs, or perhaps the complaining joints of a massive bed frame, though few beds in Blackwood were actually equipped with springs. It was more like the sound of a living thing, protesting under a weight it could no longer comfortably bear. The Lord Ashworth's chamber, that would be, Gareth murmured, his knife still moving with practiced, unfeeling precision. His voice was flat, devoid of surprise, but his eyes, when they met Ilara's, held a flicker of something ancient and weary, a shared understanding of a burden too often encountered. Ilara merely nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no need for words. They both knew the pattern. The arrival of a new, optimistic guest, the settling into the supposedly comfortable beds, and then, invariably, the onset of Why the Sounds. It was a familiar overture to a most unwelcome symphony. Barnaby, the stable master, arrived shortly thereafter, a man of wiry strength but with the perpetual hunch of one, carrying an invisible weight. He had heard it more clearly than the others, for his usual spot near the stable doors, where he would often stand listening to the restless pawing of the horses, offered a clearer path for sounds drifting down from the upper levels of the castle. He carried a small, chipped mug of lukewarm ale, a futile attempt at a sedative, and his brow was furrowed. "It begins then," Barnaby stated, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any discernible emotion, save for a profound existential weariness. "The new lord's bed has started its song." Gareth grunted in agreement. He seemed a hopeful one, that Lord Ashworth. Spoke of a long journey, of needing rest. Poor soul. There was no genuine pity in his voice, merely a detached observation, the kind one might offer when discussing the inevitable fate of a fly caught in a spider's web. Pity in Blackwood was a luxury rarely afforded, especially when one's own sleep was a perpetual famine. Ilara shivered, despite the warmth radiating from the kitchen hearth. "Remember old Lady Mildred, the one with the pet parrot?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She said her bed squeaked like 1,000 tiny mice gnawing at her bones all night. By morning, she was muttering gibberish, pulling at her hair. Had to be carried out of here, twitching." The memory, though decades old, was fresh enough to bring a faint pallor to her already pale cheeks. It was not a tale told to frighten new recruits, but a shared, grim piece of Blackwood lore, a cautionary whisper among those condemned to its sleepless embrace. "And the Duke of Greybrook," Barnaby added, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice, "who swore the bed was trying to speak to him. He spent the entire night arguing with it, or so his valet claimed. Woke up with his eyes bloodshot, screaming about the treachery of horsehair and timber." Barnaby paused, taking a long, slow sip of his ale. He never visited again, that one. Sent a polite but very firm refusal whenever his name appeared on the guest list. These were not isolated incidents, but rather a chilling pattern of occurrences that had woven themselves into the very fabric of the castle's history. The beds, particularly those in the guest chambers, seemed to possess a peculiar sentience, or at least an uncanny ability to amplify and reflect the castle's inherent restlessness. It was as if the wood itself, seasoned by centuries of human wakefulness, had absorbed the profound, unspoken anxieties of countless sleepless nights, and now, in turn, began to voice them, one insidious squeak at a time. The servants, having experienced this phenomenon, or witnessed its effect on others, harbored a quiet dread. It wasn't the fright of a sudden ghost, but the insidious, drawn-out torment of relentless mechanical noise that slowly, inexorably, ground away at sanity. They knew it wasn't a haunt in the traditional sense, but something far more mundane and therefore far more maddening. The relentless, repetitive sound of something that should be still, but wasn't. "The Lord Blackwood won't like it," Elara said, stating the obvious. Another guest driven to distraction. Gareth snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "The Lord Blackwood doesn't like anything. Least of all the fact that he, too, has not seen a proper night's sleep since his christening." This was the core of Blackwood's dry humor. The universal suffering. There was a certain bleak camaraderie in their shared nocturnal torment. They were all in the same boat, or rather, the same perpetually awake castle. As the hours dragged on, marked by the slow, painful creep of the moon across the narrow window of the scullery, the sounds from above began to intensify. The single, faint squeak from Lord Ashworth's chamber was no longer alone. Now, there were others. Faint at first, like distant echoes, then gradually growing clearer, more distinct. A faint bay creaking from the chamber near the west turret. A high-pitched, almost reedy chirpy from the servants' quarters on the floor below. A deep, resonant awe-groan that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the great hall, perhaps from the enormous, rarely used bed reserved for the most senior of guests. Each sound was unique, its own particular timbre, its own distinctive complaint. Midge, still kneading her dough, stopped altogether. Her hands, dusted white with flour, hovered over the smooth surface. Her head tilted, listening intently. A faint pattern was emerging. It was not random. The squeaks seemed to respond, not to external stimuli, but to some internal, unseen rhythm. They were not sudden bursts, but slow, drawn-out expressions of friction, like someone slowly, deliberately, rubbing two pieces of dry wood together. And they were increasing in frequency. "They're all starting," Midge whispered, her voice barely a breath. It was a statement of dread, a prophecy fulfilled. The collective exhaustion of generations, perhaps, had finally given a voice to the very structures designed for rest. The beds of Blackwood Castle, from the Lord's opulent four-poster to the humble cot of a scullery maid, were beginning to stir, not with the settling sighs of old furniture, but with a peculiar, unsettling language of their own, a language that spoke only of restlessness, a prelude to a night that promised to be profoundly, comprehensively horrifying, not through loud bangs or spectral apparitions, but through the insidious, ceaseless protest of timber and fabric, a universal chorus of discontent that threatened to rob every soul within the castle walls of even the briefest moment of peace. The air in the kitchen, already heavy with the scent of yeast and damp stone, seemed to grow thicker, charged with an unspoken apprehension, as the subtle, growing symphony of the beds began its slow, deliberate build-up. Chapter 5. The Squeak spreads. Lord Ashworth lay rigid in the colossal bed, his eyes, despite their desperate fatigue, now wide open and staring into the inky blackness. The rushlight, his sole companion, had finally succumbed to the oppressive stillness of the castle, leaving him in a darkness so profound it felt almost tangible, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and light alike. The third squeak, sharp and insistent, still echoed faintly in the cavernous chamber, a ghost of friction that resonated more in his mind than in the air. He waited, held his breath, straining every nerve, expecting a fourth, a fifth, a continuous symphony of mechanical lamentations. But there was nothing. Only the deep, resonant silence of ancient stone, a silence so utterly complete that it seemed to hum with an unheard frequency. A vast, waiting emptiness. He shifted, just a fraction, a micro-movement of his shoulder against the unyielding pillow. The bed, as if in immediate protest, responded with another faint squeak. This one a little different, a higher pitch, like a distant, reedy sigh. It seemed to come from the foot of the bed this time, a small, unhappy voice emerging from the dark, carved wood. Lord Ashworth frowned in the darkness. This was no mere settling. This was a pattern. A peculiar, almost deliberate pattern of complaint. He had encountered old furniture before, creaking and groaning as one shifted, but this felt personal. As if the bed itself resented his presence, or perhaps, more accurately, resented the very idea of repose. His muscles, which had been slowly unknotting, now tightened again, a subtle knot of tension forming between his shoulder blades. The promise of blissful slumber, so tantalizingly close moments ago, seemed to recede, pulling away like a tide. He lay still, utterly still, hardly daring to breathe. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself it was merely the effect of travel-weary nerves, an overactive imagination spurred by an empty stomach and an uncomfortable journey. But the sounds, though faint, were undeniably there, distinct and oddly specific. They were not the general groans of a centuries-old building settling into the night. They were the sounds of something withining the bed, protesting. A hinge in the headboard, perhaps. A loosened joint in the frame. A particular spring, if indeed there were any, expressing its metallic anguish. It was maddeningly subtle, just enough to catch the ear, just enough to prevent the mind from drifting into the soothing oblivion of sleep. It was the kind of sound that, if you truly committed to ignoring it, would morph into something far more irritating in its imagined absence. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the silence in his chamber was suddenly, subtly, intruded upon by something new. Unsettling, very faint. A sound that was not Yishir bed. From somewhere far off, somewhere deeper within the sprawling stone maw of the castle, a delicate, almost ghostly creaking reached his ears. It was so soft it might have been imagined, a mere whisper carried on the imperceptible currents of air that stirred through ancient passageways. Then another. A faint, high-pitched whine, like a rusty gate swinging slowly in a distant, forgotten courtyard. And another, a deeper, more resonant, groan, almost a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very flagstones beneath his chamber, rising from the profound depths of the castle's foundations. Lord Ashworth's brow furrowed. He sat up slightly, propping himself on an elbow, listening intently. His own bed, as if sensing his renewed wakefulness, immediately offered a short, sharp squeak from directly beneath his hip, a rude reminder of its own presence. He ignored it, his attention now fixed on the faint, distant chorus that was slowly, insidiously beginning to coalesce around him. It was like listening to a grand orchestra, tuning up, but an orchestra composed solely of geriatric beds, each one offering its own unique contribution of friction and strain. In the Lord and Lady Blackwood's chamber, across the great hall, and up a winding flight of narrow servant stairs, Lord Alaric Blackwood lay on his own massive, intricately carved four-poster bed. His wife, Lady Isolde, was beside him, her breathing shallow and uneven, her eyes, too, open and fixed on the dim, patterned ceiling. They had long since abandoned the pretense of sleep. Their bed, a monumental affair of dark, polished oak, had been issuing a soft, rhythmic, creak for the better part of an hour, a sound as familiar to them as their own heartbeats. It was the ancestral bed, and it carried the weight of generations of sleeplessness, its very timbers permeated with the restless energy of their forebears. Tonight, however, the familiar sounds of their own bed were joined by a new, more unsettling symphony. "Did you hear that, my dear?" Lady Isolde whispered, her voice a dry rustle in the gloom. "That faint chirpa from the south wing? I believe that's the Grey Chamber. Old man Fitzwilliam is in there tonight, isn't he? He'll be quite undone by morning." Lord Blackwood grunted, a sound of weary resignation. "No doubt. And the one from the kitchen wing? A rather insistent young whine, like a trapped badger." That would be the scullery maid's cot, I dare say. Poor girl. Still, they all begin eventually. It's simply how Blackwood chooses to greet its inhabitants. He shifted, producing a particularly loud groan from the base of their own bed, a sound so profound it seemed to a man express the accumulated anguish of centuries. He sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation that seemed to deflate him further into the unyielding mattress. One learns to distinguish them, you know. Each bed has its own voice, its own peculiar complaint. The guest chambers are always the most vocal, I find. Perhaps it's the novelty of a new weight upon their ancient timbers. There was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of dry humor in his voice, the kind of humor born of profound and unavoidable suffering. Across the castle, in the slightly less grand chamber reserved for the visiting Squire Edmund, a young man of robust constitution and a keen desire for uncomplicated sleep, the effect was far more disorienting. He had fallen asleep, truly, deeply, within moments of his head touching the pillow. But then, an almost imperceptible scraper from the far corner of his otherwise quiet room had tugged him back. He had ignored it, pulling his pillow over his head. Then came a series of faint, almost whispered thumps, rhythmic and soft, like a very small, very polite phantom attempting to make a pudding. It was his bed, he realized, upon waking again, his heart thrumming with a quiet annoyance. The mattress itself seemed to be breathing, or rather sighing, with each faint movement of the structure beneath him. And now he heard it too, faint, distant echoes, a low, soft uncreaking from below, a high, thin whining from somewhere above. He pulled the blanket up to his ears, a futile attempt to seal out the insidious encroaching soundscape. This was not the silence he had been promised. This was a slow, agonizing descent into a peculiar form of auditory purgatory. The servants, already awake as a matter of routine, experienced the spread of the squeaks with a grim, knowing acceptance. In the kitchen, Gareth the cook stirred a pot of cold gruel, his face impassive. He heard the lord's bed, a deep, resonant bee-thrumming, like a distant, troubled bee. He heard the lady's bed, a more delicate, almost effeminate, all tinkly of friction, like tiny bells chiming softly. And now, distinctly from the north tower, a new sound, a series of short, sharp rat-a-tat squeaks, like a small woodpecker attempting to tunnel through a particularly stubborn piece of oak. Ah, the old master's chamber, Gareth muttered to no one in particular. He'll be up soon, mark my words. Pacing, no doubt, muttering about the price of hay and the indignities of a sleepless grave. Old Midge, still by the kneading trough, her flour-dusted hands now clasped together as if in prayer, cocked her head. The sounds were multiplying. They were distinct, each with its own signature, yet they harmonized into a low, pervasive hum of protest. It wasn't a cacophony, not yet. It was more like a slow, deliberate conversation, held in a language of friction and weariness, conducted by all the beds of Blackwood Castle. The castle was vast, its chambers numerous, and each one, it seemed, harbored a bed that had its own particular grievance to air. A faint, drawn-out wheezing from the east wing, like an asthmatic bellows. A soft, repetitive tick-tock from a forgotten linen cupboard, where a cot was sometimes laid out for an exhausted stable boy. A low, almost guttural groan that seemed to come from the very depths of the cellar, where the servants' oldest, most worn beds resided. The horror of it was not in its loudness, but in its persistence, its ubiquity, its absolute unyielding denial of peace. It was a subtle, insidious torment, far more effective than any crashing chain or ghostly wail could ever be. For what truly breaks a soul is not sudden terror, but the slow, methodical erosion of comfort, the relentless chipping away at sanity by the utterly mundane. These were the sounds of wood rubbing against wood, of stretched fabric, of ancient stuffing settling and resettling. Sounds that should be comforting, signaling the embrace of rest. But here, in Blackwood, they were transmuted into harbingers of profound, frustrating wakefulness. Lord Ashworth, still propped on his elbow, listened to the growing chorus. It was faint, yes, but no longer ignorable. The very air of the castle seemed to thicken with the subtle vibrations of protesting timber. He imagined a vast, silent network of corridors, the countless chambers, each one containing a bed, and each bed, now, beginning its slow, insidious lament. It was like a peculiar, unholy awakening. The Castle of the Thousand Sleepless Nights was living up to its name, and he, Lord Ashworth, had inadvertently arrived on a night when its instruments were being carefully, meticulously tuned for a performance that promised to be agonizingly, maddeningly long. He sank back onto the pillow, but no comfort greeted him. Only the faint, almost imperceptible squeak of his own bed beneath him, now joined by the distant, collective sigh of every other bed in Castle Blackwood, all whispering their weary, friction-filled secrets into the interminable dark. The horror was in the sheer predictability of it, the quiet, inescapable truth that sleep, true sleep, was not merely elusive tonight, but utterly comprehensively, being driven from the very walls of this ancient, miserable dwelling. Chapter 6. The Nobleman's Growing Unease. The absolute, profound darkness of Lord Ashworth's chamber, which had initially promised the deepest and most luxurious slumber, had now transformed into a suffocating, almost malicious blanket. His eyes were wide open, staring into the impenetrable blackness, his gaze aching from the futile effort of discerning even the faintest outline of his hand held before his face. The rushlight had indeed died, its tiny flame having winked out with a final, almost knowing flicker what felt like hours ago, leaving him adrift in a sea of velvety night. He had lost all sense of time, a common affliction when sleep stubbornly refuses to arrive. Was it midnight? 2 hours past? Or was it already creeping towards the gray, unforgiving dawn? He had no way of knowing, no external clock, save for the slow, maddening tick of his own exasperation. The initial faint squeaker from his vast bed, which he had so readily dismissed as the innocent settling of ancient timber, had mutated. It was no longer a singular, sporadic occurrence. Now it was a persistent, subtle companion, a low, incessant whine from somewhere beneath the enormous mattress, a soft rubbing sound that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the carved wooden frame. It wasn't loud enough to jolt him upright, not immediately, but it was relentless. It was the kind of sound that slowly, insidiously, grinds away at the edges of one's sanity, like a tiny, unseen insect endlessly gnawing at a particularly durable piece of wood. Every slight shift of his weight, every adjustment of a knee or an elbow, seemed to elicit a fresh, unique complaint from the venerable piece of furniture. A soft chum-tumpum from the headboard as he turned his head, a prolonged reedy wheezing from the footboard as he stretched a leg. A brittle, almost metallic V-chirp from somewhere deep within the very springs, if they were springs at all, and not just ancient, protesting joints, as he attempted to find that elusive, perfect position for repose. He had tried every trick in his repertoire. He had counted sheep until the flock had become a blurry, indistinguishable mass of wool. He had recited his lineage backward and forward until the names blurred into a monotonous drone. He had attempted to mentally catalogue the contents of his pantry back home, then the names of all the horses in his stables, then the various types of cheese he had encountered on his travels. Nothing worked. His mind, instead of quieting, felt as though it were being slowly, meticulously scraped clean of all pleasant thoughts, leaving only a residue of mounting frustration and a curious, almost intellectual obsession with the origin of the infernal sound. The faint, distant chorus of other squeaks, which he had first heard as mere echoes in the vastness of the castle, had also grown more defined. He could now distinguish them, or so he imagined, as individual lamentations from other parts of Blackwood. A rhythmic, almost percussive acetap squeak from a chamber far above him, perhaps the Lord and Lady Blackwood's own ancestral bed. A more urgent, high-pitched whine from somewhere below, undoubtedly a servant's cot. As Master Elms had implied, the castle's influence was all-encompassing. And a low, almost guttural, groan that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the castle. A sound so profound it felt less like wood, and more like the ancient earth itself sighing in perpetual wakefulness. These were not loud sounds in themselves, no crashing noises or spectral wails. This was far more insidious. This was the sound of 1,000 minor discontents, each one too small to be truly alarming, but collectively forming an unholy, maddening symphony of restless furniture. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of futile tossing and turning, of micro-adjustments that only elicited further complaints from his bed, Lord Ashworth snapped. Not in a loud, dramatic fashion, but with the quiet, internal snap of a man pushed to the brink of his endurance by an irritant too minor to justify an outburst, yet too persistent to ignore. He could not, would not, endure another moment of this infuriating, elusive noise. He swung his legs out of the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold stone floor with a sudden jolt. The bed, perhaps sensing his movement, issued a final, particularly drawn-out ease as he left its confines, a sound that seemed to follow him like a mournful sigh. "Confound it all," he muttered into the oppressive darkness, his voice rough with disuse and burgeoning irritation. "What demon possesses this timber?" He fumbled on the small table where the rushlight had stood, his fingers brushing against cold stone, then the metal of the snuffer, then finally the familiar waxen cylinder of a fresh rushlight. He knew there was a tinderbox there somewhere. Flint and steel. His fingers, clumsy with fatigue, and a nascent tremor of annoyance scrabbled for it. After several fumbling attempts, a spark finally caught, and with a small puff of smoke, the rushlight hesitantly flickered to life. Its feeble glow, however, did little to dispel the gloom in the vast chamber. It merely illuminated a small circle around him, pushing back the darkness by mere inches, leaving the rest of the room in an even deeper, more intimidating shadow. The carved tapestries on the walls seemed to recede into the black, their somber forest scenes hinting at hidden eyes and unseen presences. Armed with his dim, wavering light, Lord Ashworth turned his attention to the bed. This was no ordinary piece of furniture. It was a massive, four-poster edifice, crafted from dark, heavily carved oak, its posts spiraling upwards like ancient, gnarled trees. The curtains, thick and burgundy, hung heavily, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He held the rushlight aloft, peering intently at the visible parts of the frame. He knelt, his knees protesting on the cold stone, and peered underneath the voluminous blankets and mattress. He expected to find a loose joint, a splintered beam, perhaps a misplaced rock, something tangible, something he could prod or jam or even perhaps, if it came to it, smash with his boot in a fit of thoroughly undignified pique. But there was nothing. The heavy oak beams of the frame appeared solid, unyielding, their joinery precise and tight, as if they had been assembled a mere day ago, not centuries. He ran his hand along the smooth, cold wood, feeling for any tremor, any give, any slight movement that might explain the incessant sounds. His fingers found only an unwavering solidity. He pushed against one of the massive posts, then another. They stood firm, unbudging. He tried to gently rock the entire frame. Not a wobble. The bed, to all outward appearances, was as steadfast and silent as the castle walls themselves. He moved to the side, then to the foot, then to the headboard, running his hands over every joint, every visible tenon and mortise. He leaned in close, his ear almost touching the cold wood, listening intently for the telltale creak of friction. But when he was directly upon it, the specific squeak seemed to cease, only to resume faintly, mockingly, from a different, indiscernible point the moment he moved away. It was as if the sound itself were playing a mischievous game, retreating into the very fabric of the wood, refusing to reveal its source to direct investigation. He even cautiously lifted a corner of the enormous mattress, a feat of strength that brought a fresh groan from his weary muscles. Beneath the heavy fabric he saw layers of straw, horsehair, and possibly, though he couldn't be certain in the dim light, some kind of dried plant matter, all packed tightly. There were no visible springs to inspect, no obvious mechanism for the constant complaint. It was just a vast, unyielding mound of organic material resting on solid wooden slats. He lowered the mattress, which settled back onto the frame with a deep, muffled sigh, a sound that oddly resonated with his own mounting frustration. The rushlight cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance with malicious glee at his fruitless efforts. He stood up, his back aching, a profound sense of baffled defeat washing over him. It was a bed. A simple, albeit very old and very large, bed. How could something so fundamentally inanimate produce such a persistent, varied, and untraceable chorus of complaints? It was less like the groan of old wood, and more like a subtle, pervasive form of auditory torment, designed by some ancient, insomniac craftsman. The absurdity of it was almost comical, yet in his current state of profound exhaustion, it was anything but. He paced the small, illuminated circle of his chamber. The cold stone floor, a stark contrast to the deceptive warmth of the bed. As he walked, he continued to hear them. His own bed, now liberated from his weight, gave off a slow, irregular squeak, squeak, creak, as if it were settling back into its own comfortable pattern of restless complaint. And beyond his chamber, through the thick stone walls, he could still discern the faint, insidious symphony of the other beds. The rhythmic E-tap squeaky from above, now perhaps a little louder. The distant whine from below, sounding almost like a plaintive animal. The deeper, resonant U-groan that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the castle. It was a widespread phenomenon, not localized to his own chamber, yet this knowledge did nothing to alleviate his mounting unease. In fact, it only deepened it. This was not a flaw in his particular bed. This was a castle-wide affliction, a pervasive, shared misery. He pressed his ear against the cold, rough stone of the wall nearest his bed, listening. The sounds seemed to magnify, but not in a way that offered clarity. Instead, they blended into a vague, low hum of friction, a collective sigh of ancient discomfort that permeated the very masonry. It was as if the castle itself was breathing, a giant stony beast, and its breath was the endless, weary sound of its myriad beds. Lord Ashworth let out a long, slow breath, a plume of visible mist in the cold air. He had come here seeking rest, expecting the simple, uncomplicated peace that a long journey deserved. Instead, he found himself embroiled in a peculiar, silent battle with an unseen antagonist, the very structure designed to offer repose. The horror wasn't in any visible ghoul or tangible threat, but in the relentless, inescapable auditory torture of the utterly mundane. It was the kind of horror that didn't make you scream, but rather, slowly, quietly, drove you to consider very undignified and potentially violent acts against a piece of furniture. He looked at the massive, inviting, yet utterly treacherous four-poster, its dark form looming in the dim light like a silent, mocking monolith. He could not, would not return to it. Not yet. Not while its very essence seemed to vibrate with 1,000 unspoken complaints. The night, he realized with a chilling certainty, was going to be excruciatingly long, and he, Lord Ashworth, was now officially a participant in Blackwood's ancient, sleepless curse, a curse articulated not by shrieks and wails, but by the maddeningly subtle, yet ceaseless, symphony of every single bed in the entire vast and horribly awake Castle Blackwood. Chapter 7. A servant's dark confession. Lord Ashworth's chamber was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crucible of profound, maddening wakefulness. The faint, distant chorus of squeaks had swelled, subtly but undeniably, until the very air of the castle seemed to hum with a low, grating resonance. His own bed, that once promising bastion of rest, had become the epicenter of his torment. It offered not the soothing silence of sleep, but a persistent, varied symphony of complaints, a high-pitched yee from the headboard, a deeper, more guttural ho-oh-ho from the mattress springs, and a disconcerting, rhythmic kinny thump, 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 thump from the footboard, as if some unseen entity were gently, but ceaselessly, knocking. He had tried every position imaginable, from lying stiff as a board on his back, to curling into a fetal ball, to hanging one leg precariously over the side, as if to confuse the offending timber. Each micro-adjustment, each desperate shift of his weight, elicited a new, inventive complaint from the ancient wood, a fresh protest that seemed to mock his very attempt at repose. His mind, once a disciplined instrument, was now a chaotic maelstrom of fragmented thoughts, replaying the day's journey with agonizing clarity, conjuring arguments about sheep grazing rights that felt far more urgent than they ever had. The darkness, once a comfort, had become an oppressive, thought-amplifying void. He had extinguished the rushlight hours ago in a fit of frustration, hoping that absolute blackness would somehow trick his mind into slumber. It had not. Instead, it had merely intensified the auditory assault, allowing each subtle squeak to carve its way deeper into his frayed nerves. He squeezed his eyes shut until spots danced behind his lids, then opened them wide, staring blankly at the non-existent ceiling, his vision so accustomed to the dark that faint outlines of the heavy tapestries and the looming bedposts began to appear, ghost-like, and he counted not sheep, but the number of times his bed emitted a specific creak, then the number of times the more distant whine from another chamber intruded upon his forced calm. He tried to mentally trace the origins of each new sound, creating a mental map of the castle's nocturnal symphony, a map of misery. It was an exercise in utter futility, a descent into a peculiar form of quiet madness. His tongue felt thick, his eyes burned, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that mirrored the ceaseless thrumming of the castle. After what felt like an age, perhaps hours, perhaps days, he threw off the heavy blankets with a frustrated grunt that seemed to echo disproportionately in the vast chamber. His bare feet found the cold flagstones with a jarring shock that momentarily grounded him. This was beyond mere discomfort. This was a war waged against his very will to rest. He could not, would not, endure another moment of this silent, insidious torture. He needed answers. He needed silence. He needed a human voice that was not his own, not the creaking lament of the ancient furniture. Clutching his traveling cloak around him for warmth against the castle's pervasive chill, he stumbled out of his bedchamber. The corridor outside was even darker than his room, save for faint, almost imperceptible slivers of moonlight filtering through distant arrow slits. He moved by instinct, following the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and damp stone towards the general direction of the kitchens and servants' quarters. The castle was not entirely silent, he noted with a new, horrifying clarity. Beyond the constant, soft symphony of the beds, there was a subtle undercurrent of quiet activity. He heard the faint scrape of a broom somewhere far below, the distant clink of metal against stone, the soft, rhythmic puffing sound of a bellows. The castle, it seemed, was perpetually, quietly awake. He found old Midge, the laundress, exactly where he had seen her earlier that day, or rather, earlier that night, in the dimly lit scullery off the main kitchen. She was meticulously, almost reverently, polishing a small, Tarnished silver spoon, her movements slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of haste. Her face, illuminated by a single sputtering rushlight on a nearby shelf, was a landscape of deep-set wrinkles. Her eyes, though rheumy with age, held a peculiar, unnerving clarity, a wide-eyed awareness that spoke of countless sunrises observed from within the castle's sleepless embrace. She wore a thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her stooped shoulders, and her gray hair, escaping from a practical knot, clung in wisps to her forehead. "Midge," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse and fatigue. The sound seemed startlingly loud in the quiet room. She did not jump, did not even flinch. Her polishing motion merely slowed, then stopped. Her eyes, ancient and knowing, turned slowly to meet his. There was no surprise in them, only a profound, weary understanding. "My lord," she replied, her voice a dry, papery whisper, like autumn leaves skittering across a cobbled path. "I presumed you would be joining us." Her gaze flickered to his disheveled appearance, his cloak hastily thrown on, his bare feet. But she made no comment. There was a quiet, almost pitying acceptance in her eyes that chilled him more than the cold stones. Lord Ashworth ignored her comment, his own desperation overriding any sense of decorum. "I cannot sleep," he declared, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The bed, it squeaks incessantly. And the others, I hear them too. A chorus of them. What is this place?" He gestured vaguely, his hands sweeping through the damp, cold air. "Why does this castle deny sleep?" Midge's ancient lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of grim, shared experience. "Denny sleep, my lord." "Oh, it does far more than that." She set the polished spoon down with exquisite care, then picked up a small, unadorned wooden cup, filled it with lukewarm, tasteless water from a bucket, and offered it to him. "Drink, my lord. You look like a man who has wrestled with a particularly stubborn ghost, and lost." He took the cup, grateful for the cold liquid that soothed his parched throat. He drank deeply, then handed it back. "A ghost," he scoffed, though the word felt hollow. "I have heard no wails, no clanking chains, only sounds of wood, of friction, but relentless. Madaning Gonate." Midge nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if recalling forgotten centuries. "Not all ghosts walk, my lord. Some merely whisper. Or in the case of this old place, they moan, or creak, or squeak." She paused, then settled herself on a low, three-legged stool, her movements slow and deliberate. "You ask why? The truth, my lord, is older than the oldest living tree in Oakhaven Forest." She began to speak, her voice a low, rhythmic drone that, despite its unsettling content, possessed a peculiar, almost soothing quality, like the distant, indistinct murmur of a river. "They say," she began, "that the very first Lord Blackwood, a man named Grimwald, was obsessed with defense. Every stone, every beam, every window slit was placed for protection. But he was also a man who believed sleep was a weakness, a gateway to sloth and vulnerability. He drove his workmen, they say, to exhaustion, made them work through the nights, sometimes for days without proper rest. He himself would patrol, a burning torch in hand, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, ensuring no one succumbed to slumber. He believed that if his castle never truly slept, it would always be watchful, always invincible. And perhaps, my lord, he succeeded more than he knew." She paused, her gaze drifting to the rough-hewn ceiling. "The squeaks," she continued, soft but constant from Lord Ashworth's chamber and from other distant rooms, seemed to respond to her words, a low, collective murmur of assent. "In the old days, my lord, before the great silence, the beds in this castle, They spoke. Lord Ashworth leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. Spoke? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? They didn't speak with words, not in the way you or I speak, Midge clarified, her tone matter-of-fact. But the noises they made. Oh, they were far more than mere squeaks and groans. They were insistent. They would begin softly, as yours has, then grow and grow, changing their cadence, their pitch, until they seemed to be communicating. To the sleepless, my lord. To those deprived of their wits by weeks of wakefulness, those sounds became voices. Not the voices of ghosts, no, but the voices of their own fears, their regrets, their deepest anxieties. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, met his, and he felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The sounds, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, would twist themselves into patterns. A persistent rat-a-tat-ta might sound, to a mind half mad with exhaustion, like the relentless tapping of a debt collector at the door. A long drawn-out wheezing would become the dying breath of a loved one. And a quick, sharp thump, 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 thump. That, my lord, could be the sound of your own heart, beating itself to death, trying to break free from your ribs. She sighed, a sound of profound ancient weariness. It was an insidious form of torment. It wasn't the fright that killed you, but the slow, methodical dismantling of your sanity. The beds, they absorbed it, my lord. All of that unspoken fear, all that quiet desperation. They became receptacles, and then they would reflect it back, amplify it, until the poor souls lying within them believed the very wood was mocking them, whispering their failures, counting their mistakes. And what happened then? Lord Ashworth asked, his voice hoarse, a strange cold shiver running down his spine despite the castle's chill. Tragedy, my lord, Midge said simply, her gaze unwavering. There was a time, perhaps 2 centuries ago, when a particularly large family resided here. They were a boisterous lot, full of life. But then, the beds began their speaking in earnest. One by one, the family members succumbed. The eldest son, Lord Theobald, was found one morning, gibbering in his bed, convinced the four-poster was accusing him of every petty sin he had ever committed. He died of a fever, they said, but it was despair that truly took him. His wife, Lady Eleanor, being convinced her bed was sighing with the unfulfilled dreams of her ancestors. She would spend her nights arguing with it, screaming at the wood, until her voice gave out. She starved herself, believing the bed was telling her she was unworthy of sustenance. Even the children, my lord, young Master Arthur, no older than 10, would sit up all night, clutching his ears, swearing his cot was whispering tales of unspeakable terrors. He eventually lost his sight, from the strain, some said, but his mind was already gone. She paused, a long heavy silence descending upon the scullery, broken only by the persistent distant squeaks from the castle's many chambers, each one now imbued with a terrifying new meaning for Lord Ashworth. His own bed, somewhere above, gave a particularly loud, insistent creak, thump, after the last of that family had either died or been carried away, quite undone. There was a period of silence, Midge continued, her voice even lower now. A blessed, terrifying silence. For nearly a century, the beds were quiet. Oh, they still denied sleep, as is their nature, but they were mute. They simply held their occupants in relentless, quiet wakefulness. It was a mercy, in its own way. But then, slowly, perhaps 50 years ago, the faint sounds began again. The little squeaks, the creaks, the groans. Always faint, always dismissible, if one were not listening too closely. They haven't reached the old speaking yet, my lord. Not the way they used to. But they are growing, and they are watching, or listening, and waiting. She looked at Lord Ashworth, her eyes piercing the gloom. "Your bed, my lord. It seems to have a particular vigor tonight. It has been quiet for a long time, that chamber. Perhaps it is excited by the prospect of a new listener. A new story to tell, perhaps, or a new mind to wear down." She gave a faint, mirthless smile, then slowly picked up the spoon again, resuming her slow, methodical polishing, her movements now taking on a chillingly detached quality, as if she were polishing not silver, but the very concept of ceaseless, mechanical torment. The squeaks from the distant chamber seemed to swell, a soft, insidious chorus of anticipation, a language of friction, a harbinger of a night that promised to be not merely sleepless, but filled with the quiet, unsettling, and ultimately maddening whispers of Blackwood's ancient, wakeful beds. Lord Ashworth stood frozen, the cold dread turning into a profound existential horror. He had wanted answers, and now he had them. And the knowledge was far, far worse than the maddening sounds themselves. Chapter 8. The squeaking reaches a crescendo. Lord Ashworth stood frozen in the damp, chilled scullery, the echo of Midge's words reverberating in his skull, far more chilling than any ghost story. They spoke, she had said, not with words, but with the voices of their own fears, the slow, methodical dismantling of your sanity. And then they are growing, and they are watching, or listening, and waiting. Her ancient eyes, so unnervingly clear, held a profound, dispassionate knowledge, a weariness born of seeing this very torment unfold across generations. The constant, soft symphony of squeaks from his own chamber, and the faint, unsettling responses from distant beds across the castle, now took on a terrifying new dimension. They were not merely sounds. They were the slow, insidious tuning of instruments for a personal psychological siege. Just as this realization settled upon him, a new sound, sharp and distinct, cut through the quiet. It was a high-pitched, almost desperate squeal from directly above, unmistakably from his own chamber. It was followed almost immediately by a deep, shuddering rongra that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath their feet, a sound so profound it felt less like wood and more like the very bones of the earth protesting. Midge, who had resumed her slow, deliberate polishing of the spoon, did not flinch, but her movements became infinitesimally slower, her gaze fixed on the wall, as if listening to something only she could truly comprehend. Then it began. Not gradually, not subtly, but with a terrifying, almost orchestrated suddenness. The faint, sporadic squeaks that had been the background hum of the night suddenly surged, multiplying, intensifying. From every corner of the vast, sprawling castle, from every hidden nook and forgotten cranny where a bed, no matter how humble, lay nestled, a new sound emerged. It was as if a silent signal had been given, a cue for a monstrous unseen choir to begin its performance. A cacophony erupted. It was not a chaotic, disorganized din, but a terrifyingly unified one. The squeaks, creaks, groans, whines, and thumps, which had once been individual complaints, now coalesced into a single overwhelming tidal wave of sound. The high, reedy each from one bed was perfectly counterpointed by the deep, resonant yo-ho of another. The rapid rat-a-tat-ta of a guest chamber's four-poster seemed to provide a percussive beat to the long, drawn-out wheezing of a servant's cot in the attic. It was a chorus of friction, a symphony of suffering, played on the aged, complaining instruments of Blackwood's countless beds. Lord Ashworth instinctively clapped his hands over his ears. But it was futile. The sound was not merely external. It felt as though it vibrated within his very skull, rattling his teeth, buzzing behind his eyes. The air in the scullery, previously damp and still, now seemed to shimmer with the sheer volume of the sound, a thick, palpable pressure that pressed down upon him. The quiet, insidious torment he had experienced moments ago had transformed into a deafening, unnatural crescendo. Mitch, still polishing, finally looked up. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly calm, met his. There was no pity in them now, only a bleak, knowing acceptance. This, her gaze seemed to say, was the true voice of Blackwood. This was the curse unspooling itself in full. The sound swelled, becoming a physical presence. It was a sound that defied description, for it was composed of countless individual squeaks, each unique in its timbre and rhythm, yet all contributing to a single, monolithic sonic wall. It was the sound of wood fibers tearing, of ancient metal grinding, of horsehair compacting under invisible weight. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, maddening complaints, multiplied and amplified until they became an all-consuming roar. The stone walls of the scullery seemed to hum with it, the very flagstones vibrating underfoot. The rushlight, already sputtering, flickered wildly, its feeble flame dancing as if struggling against the invisible vibrations, before finally extinguishing with a tiny, futile puff, plunging them into absolute darkness, which only seemed to intensify the auditory assault. Beyond the scullery, throughout the cold, echoing passages of the castle, others were experiencing the crescendo with their own distinct varieties of horror. In the opulent ancestral bedchamber, Lord Alaric Blackwood and Lady Isolde lay side by side, their eyes wide and unblinking in the pitch black. Their own bed, which had been offering its familiar rhythmic creak, 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 now joined the grand orchestra with a particularly vigorous, almost gleeful series of high-pitched squeals that seemed to mock their very attempt at stillness. Lady Isolde whimpered, a thin, reedy sound lost beneath the overwhelming din. "This is it, Alaric," she whispered, though her voice was drowned out by the pervasive screeching. "It's happening again. The beds, they're screaming." She pushed herself up, her silk nightgown rustling faintly against the unyielding mattress. But the movement only caused their bed to emit a fresh volley of protesting sounds, a cacophony of groans and shrieks that seemed to rise directly from beneath them. Lord Blackwood, a man usually stoic to the point of petrification, felt a tremor run through him. This was worse than the last time, he thought. Far worse. The sheer volume, the unity of it. It was as if the castle itself was having an attack of nervous tics, a grand stone edifice suffering from an acute case of sonic agitation. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples, a futile attempt to muffle the impossible noise. It felt as though 1,000 unseen hands were rubbing pieces of dry wood together, ceaselessly, endlessly, in every single corner of his ancestral home, in the relatively humble chamber of Squire Edmund. The young man who had so confidently looked forward to uncomplicated sleep, the effect was far more immediate and visceral. He had been on the verge of finally drifting off, having endured the earlier subtle murmurs with a forced patience. When the crescendo hit, it was like a sudden physical blow to his ears, a sonic punch that ripped him from the edge of slumber and slammed him back into wide-eyed, frantic wakefulness. His cot, a simple, sturdy, wooden frame, began to rattle and squeak with a rapid, almost frantic rhythm, as if it were shivering from an unseen chill. From the adjacent chamber, through the thick stone wall, came a series of sharp, almost metallic screeches, like nails being dragged across a vast, invisible chalkboard. From the room above, a dull, repetitive squeak, thud squeak, hammered at his consciousness relentlessly. Edmund sprang from his bed, stumbling in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a rising wave of panic, raw and unreasoning. This was no old house settling. This was something alive, something malicious, something orchestrating this nightmare. He fumbled for his tinderbox. His hand shaking so violently he dropped it with a clatter that was barely audible beneath the overwhelming roar of the beds. The room felt less like a safe haven and more like a vibrating cage, the air thick with the unseen. unheard pressure of thousands upon thousands of insistent, grating sounds. He could feel the vibrations through the stone floor, through the very soles of his feet, a low, resonant hum that permeated his entire being. His mind, so clear just moments ago, began to feel fuzzy at the edges, assailed by the relentless sensory input. He wanted to scream, but the sound would be swallowed whole by the castle's newfound voice. In the servants' quarters, the situation was no less dire, though perhaps met with a more resigned grimace than outright panic. Gareth, the cook, stood perfectly still by his now cold stove, his massive frame radiating an almost superhuman patience. He held a wooden spoon, forgotten, suspended in mid-air. His eyes, usually half closed with chronic exhaustion, were now wide open, staring blankly ahead, absorbing the full, unadulterated force of the sound. The low, guttural groan of the cellar beds was now amplified, a deep, continuous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The insistent tick-tock of the linen cupboard cot had sped up, becoming a rapid, frantic rhythm, like 1,000 tiny, demented clocks all striking at once. Barnaby, the stable master, who had returned from his nocturnal grooming in the stables, which, mercifully seemed, spared the immediate effects, though the horses were undoubtedly agitated, found himself leaning against a cold stone wall in the main corridor, his face pale beneath his customary grime. His ears, usually attuned to the softest whicker of a horse, were now assaulted by an impossible din. The squeaking was a physical thing, clawing at his eardrums, scraping at his sanity. He could identify individual beds in the cacophony, the Lord's bed, with its deep, authoritative thrum, the lady's with its sharp, almost hysterical shriek, even his own cot in the corner of the stable wing, a rhythmic, grating rasp that spoke of ancient worn straw. It was like 1,000 badly tuned harps, all being played at once, their strings made of dried sinew and rusty wire. The full-blown crescendo was a symphony of agony. It filled every inch of the vast castle, seeped through the thickest walls, and bypassed the most tightly shut doors. It was a sound that was impossible to escape, impossible to ignore, impossible to filter out. It was omnipresent, relentless, and utterly, fundamentally wrong. It was the sound of something that should offer solace and quietude, now screaming its unending protest. It was the sound of rest being systematically, mercilessly denied by the very objects designed to provide it. Lord Ashworth, still standing in the scullery, the echo of Midge's words about the bed speaking to the mad playing on an endless loop in his mind, felt a peculiar, terrifying clarity emerge through the auditory storm. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense, no spectral chains or phantom screams. This was far more insidious, far more horrifying. It was the absolute, unyielding denial of sanity, orchestrated by the mundane, amplified to the very edge of human endurance. The castle had not merely refused sleep, it had weaponized wakefulness. And as the deafening, unnatural chorus reached its peak, a single, horrifying thought formed in Lord Ashworth's mind, a thought that seemed to be whispered directly by the collective voice of the screeching beds. This is only the beginning of the night. Chapter 9. The Nobleman's Desperate Search. Midge's words, still echoing in the damp confines of the stone room, had painted a grim tableau, transforming the maddening squeaks into a language of psychological torment. This was no mere draft, no settling of timbers. This was a siege, rugged by the very objects designed for repose, orchestrated by centuries of accumulated, frustrated wakefulness. The high-pitched squeal from his own chamber above, the deep, shuddering eye-groan from the foundations, and the collective, unified roar of countless other beds now felt less like mechanical friction, and more like a vast, inhuman chorus, each note a deliberate jab at his sanity. His ears throbbed, his teeth felt as though they vibrated within their sockets, and the very air seemed to thicken with the oppressive weight of the sound. The rushlight had died, plunging the scullery into absolute, starless blackness, intensifying the auditory assault until it was all that existed. He tore his hands away from his ears, a futile gesture against a sound that felt as if it originated within his very skull. His mind, which had moments ago been merely exhausted, now raced with a frantic, desperate energy. He could not, would not, succumb to this slow, insidious madness. He was Lord Ashworth, a man of logic and reason, accustomed to solving problems, negotiating treaties, and bringing order to unruly estates. This was merely an unusually persistent mechanical anomaly, or perhaps a particularly cunning trick of the ancient castle's acoustics. There had to be a source, a central point, a way to silence it. He would not allow himself to be another gibbering, babbling ruin, carted out on a stretcher like poor Lady Mildred with her parrot. The thought galvanized him, injecting a frantic, cold determination into his veins. "Midgers!" he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible above the din. He reached out, his hand fumbling in the darkness, searching for her. His fingers brushed against the rough texture of her shawl. Where does it come from? The main sound. Is there a central chamber? A mechanism? Midge's reply was a dry whisper, her face a pale, indistinct blur in the profound darkness. Her eyes, however, seemed to glow with a strange, knowing luminescence. "It comes from everywhere, my lord, and from nowhere. It is the breath of Blackwood, its heart, and its lungs. There is no central point for torment." She resumed her slow, rhythmic, polishing motion, the faintest scrape of the silver against the cloth audible only because it was so close, so deliberate, a tiny counterpoint to the castle's grand, horrifying symphony. Her stoic acceptance in the face of such overwhelming noise was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Lord Ashworth ignored her fatalistic pronouncement. He couldn't accept it. His rational mind rebelled against the notion of a castle's very essence being a source of maddening sound. There had to be a way. He spun on his heel, stumbling slightly over a misplaced bucket. He had to find a lamp, a lantern, anything that would pierce this oppressive gloom. His bare feet slapped against the cold flagstones as he fumbled along the wall, searching for a familiar niche, a forgotten sconce. His hands, clumsy with sleep deprivation and mounting panic, finally closed around the cold iron of a torch bracket. He knew from earlier in the day that the servants kept a supply of torches and tinder near the kitchens. He scrabbled at the bracket, pulling free a heavy, resin-soaked torch. Finding the tinder box was harder in the enveloping darkness, but the increasing urgency, the desperate need for light, pushed him on. His fingers, trembling, finally found the flint and steel. Sparks flew, small fleeting stars in the endless night, and with a grunt of relief he finally coaxed a flame into life. The torch sputtered, casting wild, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank, making the scullery appear to writhe with unseen presences. Its smoky light, however, was a welcome beacon against the oppressive darkness. He saw Midge, her face placid and undisturbed by the roaring din, her polishing motions serene and endless. He gave her a frantic nod, a gesture of desperate farewell, and stumbled out of the scullery into the narrow, winding corridors that led deeper into the castle's labyrinthine interior. The sound instantly intensified. In the scullery, it had been a contained roar. In the corridors, it was a living entity, pressing in on him from all sides. Each squeak, each groan, each thrum seemed to reverberate off the ancient stone, multiplying, echoing, creating a sensation that was less about hearing and more about a feeling the sound vibrate through his very bones. The stone walls seemed to hum with it, the air itself thrummed. It was a cacophony of misery, 1,000 discordant notes played in sickening unison. His torchlight danced, casting fleeting glimpses of faded tapestries, their somber hunting scenes now appearing frantic, the hounds howling in silent sympathy with the beds. He moved with a frantic, stumbling urgency, his bare feet surprisingly quick on the cold, uneven flagstones. He was driven by a single overriding imperative: to find the source, to understand this phenomenon before it utterly broke him. He passed familiar archways that seemed alien in the dancing shadows, the ancient stones radiating the pervasive vibration. The rhythmic thump, 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 thump from his own chamber above was now distinct, a relentless drumbeat in the awful symphony. He recognized the high-pitched wash-screech from the grand hall, where perhaps a guest bed had once stood. He identified the low, guttural rumble from the deepest parts of the castle, a sound that conjured images of the castle's very foundations grinding together in torment. He passed a low, arched doorway leading to what he suspected were the guards' barracks. From within, the squeaking was a more uniform, lower-pitched grind, punctuated by sporadic, almost desperate gigitatsubski. He imagined the guards, hardened men of war, tossing and turning on their rough cots, their faces etched with the same profound exhaustion as the servants. The very notion made him laugh, a short, humorless spark that was immediately swallowed by the overwhelming din. This was a war indeed, but one against which swords and shields were utterly useless. He found himself in a wide, echoing passage that led to the various guest chambers, the ones Master Elms had shown him earlier in the evening. Here, the chorus of squeaks reached a new pitch of intensity. Each door seemed to pulse with its own unique complaint. One chamber emitted a rapid, almost frantic squeak clatter, like a skeleton performing a jig on a loose floorboard. Another resonated with a long, drawn-out wheezing, like a rusty hinge slowly giving up the ghost. From a third, a deeper, repetitive thump, punctuated by a peculiar, wet squawk. Lord Ashworth pressed his ear against one of the heavy oak doors, the wood vibrating against his cheek. The sound was deafening, a localized crescendo that seemed to mock his very proximity. He imagined the poor souls inside, undoubtedly as awake and tormented as he was, staring into the dark, listening to their own private mechanical hell. What could they be thinking? What madness might be brewing behind those unyielding doors? He stumbled onward, driven by a frantic, unthinking desperation. He knew not what he sought, only that he must find something. A loose cog, a hidden mechanism, a forgotten lever that, when pulled, would silence this unbearable symphony. The logical part of his brain, though battered and bruised by the relentless noise, still clung to the absurd hope that this was a problem with a mechanical solution, not a pervasive, existential curse. But the sheer universality of the sounds, the way they radiated from every bed, from every direction, began to chip away at this last bastion of reason. He ascended a narrow, spiraling staircase, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of weary footsteps. The torchlight struggled to penetrate the gloom above and below. As he climbed, the pitch of the squeak seemed to shift, becoming higher, sharper, more insistent. This was the direction of the upper chambers, often reserved for less important guests, or in times of full occupancy overflow from the main family. He could hear a particularly shrill eek from directly above, followed by a soft, almost plaintive mooing, like a cow in distress. He reached a small landing, faced with another heavy studded door. This one, he dimly recalled, was supposedly empty tonight, a chamber usually kept locked. Yet, from behind it, he heard a distinct rhythmic tick-tock squeaking, like a grandfather clock whose internal mechanisms were slowly, agonizingly ceasing up. He pressed his hand against the cold wood. The door seemed to pulse with the sound. Even an empty room, it seemed, could not escape Blackwood's peculiar torment. The beds, he realized with a chilling surge of dread, did not need a body to complain. They simply were perpetually restless, perpetually vocal. His growing madness manifested as a distorted sense of time and space. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before him, twisting and turning in a futile mockery of escape. The squeaks, which had initially been a unified roar, now began to separate in his mind, each distinct sound morphing into a subtle, almost personalized insult. The yi-weijing from the east wing sounded like a judgmental sigh. The éclateur from the guards' barracks felt like a sneer. The high-pitched e-chirpo from the south tower was an endless, irritating giggle. His thoughts, once orderly, became disjointed, fragments of treaties and sheep-grazing rites mingling with the relentless, percussive squeaking of every bed in the castle. He found himself muttering, low and incoherent, to the vibrating walls, pleading for a moment of quiet, for the briefest respite. He stumbled into what appeared to be the castle's library, its vast shelves stretching into the unseen darkness, filled with countless tomes of ancient lore and forgotten histories. Here, the sound was muted slightly by the thick tapestries and the sheer volume of books, but it was still pervasive, a low, constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very spines of the leather-bound volumes. He imagined each book whispering its own sleepless tale, each page rustling with unspoken anxieties. His eyes, burning with fatigue, scanned the shadowy shelves, seeking, what? A forgotten manuscript? A magical incantation? A blueprint for silencing an entire castle? The absurdity of his quest, in this moment of profound auditory torment, was lost on him. He was beyond irony. He was simply desperate. He clutched the torch tighter, its flame flickering precariously, threatening to abandon him to the all-encompassing darkness and the relentless, maddening noise. He pressed his palms against his temples, but the sound seemed to resonate from within his own skull, a physical manifestation of the curse. This was not a temporary annoyance. This was a living, breathing, screaming entity, and he was trapped within its lungs. The squeaking reached a new peak, a sustained, unified shriek that filled every atom of the castle. It was the sound of 1,000 grievances, 1,000 restless nights, 1,000 moments of despair, all coalescing into a single, unbearable crescendo. He sank to his knees, his head bowed, his body trembling, his mind teetering on the very brink of the abyss that Midge had so calmly described. He had raced through the castle, seeking answers, seeking a way out. But all he had found was the terrifying, undeniable truth. The castle of Blackwood was awake, profoundly and horrifyingly so, and its voice was the scream of every single bed within its ancient cursed walls. And the night, he knew with a chilling certainty, was far from over. Chapter 10. The ghostly craftsman's curse, Lord Ashworth, propelled by a desperate, almost animalistic need for understanding, rather than the more dignified pursuit of repose, stumbled through the labyrinthian passages of Blackwood Castle. The crescendo of squeaking beds had not diminished. If anything, it seemed to have swollen, gaining a physical heft, a palpable pressure that bore down upon his eardrums and burrowed into the very marrow of his bones. Each turn in the corridor brought a new distinct chorus of metallic shrieks, wooden groans, and rhythmic thumps, a symphony of torment that echoed from every direction. He ran his hand along the cold, damp stone walls, seeking a purchase, a sense of reality in the auditory nightmare. His bare feet slapped against the flagstones, a sound utterly consumed by the overriding cacophony. He passed doors that seemed to thrum with contained anguish, doors behind which he knew fellow sufferers lay or sat, enduring their own unique variations of the bed's protest. He was no longer thinking of escape, only of comprehension. There had to be a source, a nexus for this maddening phenomenon. Old Midge's words, cryptic and unsettling, about the bed's speaking and the great silence that followed a past tragedy, hammered in his mind, vying for attention against the relentless, high-pitched creak from the chamber above him, and the low, guttural, gaithrum groan thrumming from the depths below. His head throbbed, a dull, relentless ache that matched the castle's pulse. He found himself, by some unseen pull, or the sheer logic of acoustics, gravitating towards the castle's older, seldom used wings, a section of masonry that felt even more ancient and neglected than the rest. Here, the air was colder, the tapestries were in tatters, and the scent of damp earth was more pronounced. The squeaking, though still omnipresent, took on a different quality here, less of a chorus, and more of a distinct, almost individual lament. It was here, in a wide, echoing passageway lined with dusty, cobweb-draped armoire, that the overall clamor momentarily thinned, allowing a single, insistent, almost melodic wick-wick-wick-wick-wing to emerge. It was a precise, rhythmic sound, not the random creak of an old beam, but something deliberate, insistent, like a tool hitting wood, or perhaps a very old, very stubborn bed rocking gently. It drew him forward, down a narrow, forgotten staircase that spiraled into the earth. The staircase ended in a small, cramped antechamber, perhaps a storage room or an unused servant's pantry, which opened into an even larger, cavernous space. This was not a living chamber. It was too vast, too rough-hewn, its walls crudely finished stone. The air here was heavy with the scent of aged timber, sawdust, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old sweat. And here, the sound was overwhelming. It was not a collective din, but a concentrated, resonant, all-creak-squeak-groan thumpum, emanating from the very center of the room. Lord Ashworth squinted into the gloom, his eyes, still accustomed to the recent absolute darkness, struggling to discern shapes. The only light came from a crack in the ceiling high above, where a sliver of pallid moonlight, filtered through layers of dust and time, illuminated a single central object. It was a bed, not a grand four-poster like his own, nor a humble cot, but a skeletal frame of raw, unpolished wood, suspended from the ceiling by thick, rusty chains. It hung perhaps a foot off the ground, swaying ever so slightly, its empty frame emitting the most profoundly unsettling squeaks and groans Lord Ashworth had yet heard. This was the source, the progenitor, the primordial squeak. It was a bed in its most fundamental form, stripped bare, yet it pulsed with an agonizing, ceaseless protest. As he stared at it, a figure began to coalesce within the dim, diffused moonlight. It was translucent, shimmering faintly, like heat haze off a summer road, yet undeniably solid in its presence. The figure was that of a man, clad in simple, rough-spun garments, his hands gnarled and calloused, one still seemingly clutching a spectral chisel, the other resting on a phantom mallet. His face, though gaunt and shadowed, bore an expression of profound, eternal weariness, his eyes, strangely bright in the dim light, fixed upon the swaying, squeaking bed. This was not the terror of a traditional ghost, no wailing banshee or rattling chain, but the quiet, persistent sorrow of a man who had never known rest, even in death. "You seek answers, my lord?" the figure asked, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, like sawdust sifting through an old, forgotten sieve. It was not loud, yet it cut through the deafening squeak of the central bed with an eerie clarity, as if it spoke directly into Lord Ashworth's skull. "You seek to understand why the very wood of this castle rejects your sleep, does it not? Why the promise of rest becomes a torment of constant complaint?" Lord Ashworth, momentarily too stunned by the apparition to feel true fear, could only nod, his throat dry, his voice lost amidst the bed's lament. The spectral figure sighed, a sound that seemed to pull at the very air in the chamber. "I am Thomas, master carpenter of this wretched pile of stones, or what remains of me. They called me the finest woodworker in the 3 counties, a man who could coax music from a stubborn plank of oak. Ah! Music indeed. This is the only music that remains of my toil. He gestured with his spectral chisel towards the squeaking bed, a gesture of profound, bitter irony. I was the one who built them all, my lord, Thomas continued, his translucent form shimmering with what seemed to be a spectral exhaustion. Every bed in this miserable castle, from your grand 4-poster to the smallest cot in the stable boy's corner. Each joint, each tenon, each mortise was crafted by these hands. And each one, my lord, bears a piece of my suffering, a gift from a craftsman denied his due. He floated closer to the central, squeaking bed, his spectral hand reaching out to touch its rough-hewn frame. Lord Grimwald, the first Blackwood, your esteemed ancestor, Thomas spat the name, a faint, almost imperceptible crackle of otherworldly anger accompanying it. He was a man obsessed with vigilance, believed sleep was the devil's lure. He would patrol the castle night after night, a flaring torch in hand, his eyes red and wild like a demon's. Enduring no man, not even his humble craftsman, rested. We worked days without end, weeks without proper slumber. My hands grew raw, my back ached like 1,000 needles, my eyes burned. But still, he drove us. A castle that sleeps is a castle that dies, he would bellow, his voice echoing off these very stones. No man shall rest while Blackwood stands. Thomas's voice grew heavier, laced with centuries of resentment. He denied us our wages too, citing our slow pace born of exhaustion. He denied us proper food. He denied us everything, my lord, but most of all he denied us the sanctity of sleep. My apprentice, young Silas, a boy no older than 10, fell asleep over his tools one night, exhaustion claiming him. Grimwald found him, my lord, found him, and beat him to death with his own walking stick right here, in this very room, where we carved the frames that were meant to hold dreams. No rest, boy, he screamed as Silas gasped his last. No rest, not even in death. The spectral carpenter turned his luminous eyes back to Lord Ashworth, and in their depths Lord Ashworth saw not malice, but a bottomless, ancient well of weariness. And so I swore. I swore by my blood, by the wood, and by the ghost of young Silas, that if I could not find rest, neither would any soul who lay upon the beds I built. I cursed them, my lord. Every joint, every nail, every plank. I whispered it into the grain of the wood, the torment of sleepless nights. I imbued them with the ceaseless friction of denied repose, the maddening whisper of shattered peace. I made sure that every bed in this castle, crafted with my own suffering, would absorb the wakefulness of those who lay upon it, then reflect it back, amplified, until sleep became an agonizing, impossible dream. He gestured around the echoing chamber, and Lord Ashworth saw for the first time, not just the central, swaying bed, but dozens of others, spectral frames hanging from unseen chains, each shimmering with a faint internal light, each emitting its own particular squeak or groan, adding to the pervasive wheek or groan, adding to the pervasive, deafening chorus that had driven him to this very spot. They were the prototypes, the first victims, the very instruments of Thomas's prolonged revenge. It was a slow curse, my lord, Thomas confessed, a hint of something resembling a grim satisfaction in his tone. It took generations to truly take hold, for the wood to soak up enough of the castle's wretchedness, for the air to thicken with enough denied slumber. But now it is mature. It is complete. Every single bed, my lord, in this entire castle, from the master's chamber to the lowest servant's cot, is alive with the ceaseless lament of my suffering. It breathes the torment of sleeplessness, and it will echo it back until every occupant is as mad as the Lord Grimwald himself. He paused, and the central bed before them emitted a particularly violent, shuddering Squeak, a sound of pure, unadulterated protest, as if reinforcing the carpenter's grim pronouncements. "They are not just squeaking, my lord," Thomas said, his voice dropping once more to a dry, intimate whisper. "They are echoing the frustrations of generations, the unfulfilled hopes, the unspoken anxieties, the quiet despair of those who sought rest here and found only vigilance. They are the accumulated sighs of 1,000 sleepless nights, compressed into the sound of grinding wood. And tonight, my lord, they have awakened fully. They are speaking. They are screaming. And they will not cease until the sun, quite exhausted itself, pulls itself over the horizon." Thomas, the ghostly carpenter, looked at Lord Ashworth, his ancient, weary eyes holding a deep, profound sadness, laced with the unyielding conviction of a man whose justice was served, however slowly, however painfully. "You cannot quiet them, my lord. You cannot fix what was broken by centuries of cruelty and denied rest. All you can do is listen. Just as I listened, night after endless night, to the sounds of my own body breaking, forced to carve wood for beds that would never truly offer peace. Welcome, my lord, to the true sound of Blackwood Castle, the sound of perpetual wakefulness." And with that, his spectral form seemed to diffuse, blending back into the heavy dust-laden air, leaving Lord Ashworth alone in the clamor, surrounded by the invisible deafening chorus of 1,000 vengeful squeaking beds, each one a testament to a craftsman's ancient, horrifying curse. Chapter 11. A bargain with the dead, spectral form of Thomas, the long-dead castle carpenter, diffused into the dust-laden air of the cold, subterranean chamber, leaving Lord Ashworth alone amidst the pervasive, physical clamor of 1,000 vengeful beds. The raw skeletal bed frame, suspended by its rusty chains in the center of the room, continued its ceaseless, agonizing Squeak, a sound that seemed to bore directly into the nobleman's very skull, stripping away any last vestiges of his composure. The collective roar from the distant chambers, a symphony of creaks, groans, whines, and thumps, pressed in on him from every stone wall, every damp corner. It was a tangible presence, a pressure that felt as though it would crush his very being, turning him into a flattened, two-dimensional caricature of a man, eyes wide and unblinking. His throat felt rough, his mouth dry as parchment, and a profound, bone-deep weariness, now amplified by the terrifying knowledge of its source, threatened to buckle his knees. His bare feet, cold and bruised from countless unseen encounters with uneven flagstones, were numb. "Thomas," Lord Ashworth rasped, his voice a reedy, pathetic sound lost beneath the overwhelming din. "Thomas, come back! I demand you return." The words, imbued with a desperate and utterly misplaced sense of aristocratic authority, felt foolish even to himself as they dissolved into the sonic assault. He spun around, his eyes, burning with unshed tears of exhaustion, scanning the gloom, searching for any shimmering outline, any faint suggestion of the spectral craftsman. The silence that had accompanied Thomas speaking, brief and tantalizing, had vanished, replaced by the full, unrelenting force of the curse. The central bed shrieked again, a sound so piercing it might have splintered glass, and then, as if in response, a cascade of sharp, percussive D-thumps and rat-a-tat-tats erupted from the unseen beds in the dark, upper reaches of the chamber. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of light coalesced near the rough-hewn stone wall, gradually resolving itself into the translucent, weary form of the ghostly carpenter. He appeared to be leaning against the wall, one hand resting on a phantom chisel, his eyes, ancient and full of bitter knowledge, fixed on Lord Ashworth with a profound, almost amused weariness. "Demand, my lord?" Thomas' voice, a dry, papery whisper, like the rustle of dead leaves, cut through the clamor once more. piercing the sound with an eerie, intimate clarity. The living may demand of the living, perhaps. But the dead, my lord, are beyond such trifles. We ask only for what was denied. He gestured with his spectral hand towards the cacophony, a gesture that encompassed not only the room, but the entirety of Blackwood Castle. And what was denied here was more than coin. It was rest. It was life. Lord Ashworth stumbled closer, his fatigue warring with a desperate surge of adrenaline. "I know. I understand," he blurted out, the words thick with genuine horror and a newfound, crushing empathy. "The Lord Grimwald's cruelty, the boy. Silas, it is unspeakable. But surely, after centuries, your vengeance must be satisfied? Look around you. This torment, this relentless sound, it affects everyone. The current Lord and Lady Blackwood, their servants, even the very stones of this place vibrate with it. It is a living hell, Thomas." The ghostly carpenter merely observed him, his eyes holding no sympathy, only the distant, detached gaze of one who had witnessed countless generations of restless despair. "A living hell, my lord? Perhaps. But it is the hell I forged for my own. And it is a testament, a monument to the price of denying a man his due. Grimwald sought a castle that would never sleep. He built a legacy of vigilance. I merely ensured his wish was granted, for all time." A faint, almost imperceptible ripple passed through his translucent form. Perhaps a shiver of satisfaction, or perhaps merely the lingering echo of his own suffering. "But it doesn't bring you peace," Lord Ashworth pleaded, his voice cracking with the strain of attempting to reason with a centuries-old grievance. "It binds you here. You are as sleepless as the beds you cursed. You are trapped by your own vengeance, Thomas." He knew, even as he spoke, that appealing to the ghost's self-interest was a long shot. But what else was there? Logic, in this clamorous, impossible night, felt like a flimsy shield against a storm. Thomas' spectral face, etched with profound fatigue, seemed to soften infinitesimally, a subtle shift in the shadows. "Peace?" he repeated, the word tasting strange on his phantom tongue. "What is peace to a man denied even the rest of the grave? I am a part of this place now, my lord, woven into the very grain of the wood. My suffering fuels their song." He gestured to the cacophony, which, if possible, seemed to swell in response, the central bed emitting a particularly grating, drawn-out on-scree. "But it doesn't have to be." Ashworth pressed, a desperate idea forming in his exhaustion-addled mind. "Grimwald wronged you. He wronged your apprentices. He stole your wages, your rest, your very life. But I am not Grimwald. The current Lord Blackwood is not Grimwald. We are different. We are capable of atonement." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the buzzing friction of the beds. "I, Lord Ashworth, will right these wrongs. I will ensure that the full, proper wages for every day you and your apprentices worked without pay are tallied and given to your descendants, if any can be found, or used to build a lasting memorial to you and young Silas, a place where peace truly reigns. I will personally oversee the creation of a proper, consecrated resting place for Silas, with all the honors due to one so unjustly taken. I will ensure a decree is passed, acknowledging Grimwald's monstrous cruelty, and forever forbidding such treatment of craftsmen within these lands." He paused, breathless, the words hanging in the air like fragile cobwebs, immediately threatened by the overwhelming squeaking. He watched Thomas' spectral form intently, searching for any flicker of reaction, any sign that his desperate offer held meaning to the ancient, suffering spirit. Thomas remained silent for a long moment, his luminous eyes fixed on Lord Ashworth, unblinking. The clamor of the bed seemed to thrum around them, a vibrating wall of sound that made sustained thought agonizingly difficult. Yet Thomas seemed unaffected by the noise, as if it were the very air he breathed. the only language he now understood. Coin, he finally rasped, his voice laced with a profound, bitter irony. A fine thing, my lord. A fine thing for the dead. As if gold could buy back the stolen hours, the broken bodies, the frayed minds. He laughed then, a dry, rustling sound, like leaves skittering across ice. And a monument? To a humble carpenter? The world barely remembers the names of kings, my lord. What chance has a craftsman, even one cursed to linger? But it would be a gesture, Lord Ashworth insisted, clinging to the thread of hope. A symbol. A public recognition of the injustice. A balm for your spirit, if not your phantom hands. It would be a different legacy for this castle, not one of endless sleeplessness, but of a wrong acknowledged, of an attempt at peace. He was aware that his words sounded grand, almost theatrical, in the face of such profound ancient suffering, but he pressed on, driven by the maddening noise and the terrifying prospect of endless wakefulness. Consider it, Thomas Testy. This torment binds you as much as it binds us. Is it not time for a different kind of rest? A rest for your spirit? Thomas turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the array of ghostly, squeaking bed frames that filled the chamber, each one glowing faintly with its own internal tormenting light. My spirit has known no rest for centuries, my lord, he murmured, his voice softer now, almost wistful. It has been woven into the timber, into the very essence of these instruments of sleeplessness. The curse is not merely spoken words, my lord. It is deeply ingrained. It is the very friction of wood on wood, of spring on frame, of fabric on mattress, imbued with the anguish of the denied. To quiet them, it would require more than gold or apologies. Then what? Lord Ashworth demanded, his desperation rising. Tell me, what would it take? What must be done? I swear on my honor, on my name. I will do whatever is in my power to see it done. Just tell me how to quiet these infernal sounds. He gestured wildly around the chamber, at the spectral beds, at the cacophony, his eyes pleading. The ghostly carpenter regarded him with an unnerving intensity. The curse, my lord, is not simply a matter of my vengeance against Grimwald. It is also the accumulated sorrow, the quiet madness, of all those who suffered sleepless nights within these walls. The beds absorbed it, you see. They became vessels of wakefulness. And now they sing their anguish back. He paused, and the central bed let out a particularly shrill, drawn-out Uneasy, like a dying breath. To quiet them, one must address the source of that absorption. The very essence of what makes a bed a place of rest, and what makes these beds a source of torment. And what is that? Lord Ashworth pressed, hanging on his every whisper. Thomas looked at him, his spectral eyes seeming to bore into Lord Ashworth's very soul. They must be gaitrally at rest, my lord, each and every one of them. For them to cease their song, they must know genuine slumber. And that, my lord, is a task far more complex than coin or monuments. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the ghost's posture, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, as if he were contemplating a truly monumental undertaking. Even for a spirit, perhaps a collective act of profound communal sleep could loosen the bonds. A true deep slumber from every soul within these walls. A sacrifice of wakefulness, so absolute that it might, just might, appease the very timbers. But how, my lord, do you bring true sleep to a castle cursed with eternal vigilance? The ghostly carpenter's form flickered, a momentary lessening of his translucence, as if the energy of his own thought had briefly given him more substance. You offer much, my lord, more than any Blackwood has offered in centuries. The idea of true rest, it is a peculiar thought for one such as I, a tantalizing one. It is a bold offer, Lord Ashworth, to break a curse woven with such profound and prolonged suffering. He looked around at the spectral beds, then back at Lord Ashworth. "Prove your earnestness, my lord. Begin the reparations. Find the living descendants of those wronged by Grimwald, if they exist, or truly deeply, establish a sanctuary of rest in Silas' name. Perform these actions, not as a bargain with the dead, but as a genuine act of repentance for the living. Show this castle and its long-suffering inhabitants that a different path is possible. And then perhaps the beds may listen. Perhaps they may consider a different song. But know this, my lord," Thomas concluded, his voice hardening. "The curse is not easily unwoven. It is a slow unraveling, like the breaking of a thread pulled tight for centuries. It will not cease overnight, even if your intentions are pure. And until then, my lord, you will listen. You will listen to every squeak, every groan, every relentless lament, just as I have, for centuries without end." With that final chilling pronouncement, Thomas's spectral form began to recede once more, not diffusing this time, but slowly, deliberately, merging with the swaying, screeching bed frame at the center of the room. The ghostly craftsman became one with the cursed object of his toil, his ethereal essence seemingly absorbed into the wood, until only the relentless, ear-splitting Squeak remained, louder, more resonant than ever. Lord Ashworth was left alone again, in the absolute darkness, surrounded by the physical manifestation of a curse he had now fully comprehended. A curse that demanded an impossible atonement. All while a collective deafening chorus of Blackwood's beds reached a new horrifying zenith, an unbearable symphony of friction that promised no rest, no peace, and no end. Chapter 12. The castle's final squeak. Lord Ashworth, left alone in the cold, subterranean chamber, the deafening Squeak of the central spectral bed, echoing his torment, found himself at a precipice of sanity. The ghost of Thomas, the master carpenter, had delivered not a threat, but a horrifying, impossible truth, a curse woven into the very fabric of Blackwood. His offer of atonement, of reparations, of a true resting place for young Silas, had been met with a chilling blend of irony and a tantalizing, almost desperate flicker of hope from the spectral craftsman. "Prove your earnestness, my lord," Thomas had rasped. "Hunt, then perhaps the beds may listen. Perhaps they may consider a different song." Sheer, overwhelming clamor of the castle's beds, a relentless symphony of mechanical anguish, pressed in on Lord Ashworth, threatening to splinter his mind into 1,000 irreparable pieces. His very bones vibrated with the ceaseless friction of wood and metal, each individual squeak contributing to a pervasive physical pressure that was almost unbearable. He had never truly understood the insidious nature of Blackwood's curse until now. It was not a sudden fright, but a slow, methodical erasure of peace, a relentless sonic assault designed to wear away sanity itself. Driven by a profound, primal need for silence, and an equally profound, albeit somewhat sleep-deprived, sense of noble responsibility, Lord Ashworth stumbled back up the winding, echoing staircase. His mission was clear, even if it felt utterly fantastical. He had to convince the living occupants of Blackwood, the weary lord and lady, the perpetually exhausted servants, to participate in an act of communal sleep, a grand collective surrender to the very state that Blackwood had always denied. It was an audacious plan, born of desperation and the lingering scent of spectral sawdust. He found Lord and Lady Blackwood in their ancestral chamber, precisely as Midge had described them, side by side in their enormous four-poster, eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom, their faces etched with the familiar, ancient weariness of their line. Their bed, the very heart of the family's inherited insomnia, was contributing a particularly vigorous, almost gleeful series of high-pitched squeals and deep, shuddering groans to the castle's cacophony. Lord Blackwood, who usually bore the weight of his ancient name with stolid, if perpetually fatigued, dignity, looked rather less like a nobleman and more like a badger roused from a very unfulfilling hibernation. Lady Isolde, usually a picture of aristocratic composure, was clutching her silk nightgown, her knuckles white. "My lords, my lady," Ashworth rasped, his voice raw from disuse and the constant vibration in his head. The effort of speaking loudly enough to be heard above the din felt monumental. I have discovered the source of your afflictions." Lord Blackwood merely grunted, a sound of profound skepticism, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, where a particularly insistent rat-a-tat squeak seemed to be celebrating its own existence. Lady Isolde, however, turned her head slowly, her eyes, though red-rimmed and dilated, holding a flicker of something akin to desperate curiosity. "The source, my lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "Are you perhaps referring to the very essence of this wretched pile of stones?" "No, my lady," Ashworth insisted, his delirium granting him a strange, fierce clarity. "A specific source. Curse. Laid by Thomas, the master carpenter, centuries ago. For Grimwald, the first Blackwood, denied him and his apprentices sleep, wages, and ultimately life itself. He then recounted, in hurried, clipped sentences, the spectral encounter, Thomas' tale of vengeful toil, the murder of Silas, and the terrible slow-burning curse woven into every plank and joint of every bed. He explained Thomas's demand for atonement, for a public recognition of the wrong, and most crucially, for a collective act of profound communal sleep, a symbolic offering of the very thing denied. Lord Blackwood listened, or rather, endured the tale, his expression a fascinating blend of weary disbelief and profound irritation. "A ghostly carpenter," he finally managed, his voice thick with a lifetime of unfulfilled rest. "And you propose we appease this phantom by forcing every soul in this castle to lie down and get to sleep? My Lord Ashworth, are you quite well? Perhaps the journey has addled your wits." "Blackwood has always been thus. It simply denies rest. It is a known fact, a peculiarity of the line, a charming, if utterly inconvenient, family trait." He punctuated his skepticism with a long, drawn-out sigh, which seemed to elicit a particularly mournful one from his own bed. "But this night is different, my lord," Ashworth urged, the omnipresent Squeaking pushing him to the brink. "The curse has reached its crescendo. It is no longer mere denial. It is active torment. Did you not feel it? The very air vibrates. This is not merely the usual sleeplessness. This is a siege upon the senses, a systematic unraveling of sanity." Lady Isolde surprisingly interjected, her voice wavering but firm. "He speaks true, Alaric. I have never known it to be this pervasive, this loud. It feels as though the very walls are screaming, and I have indeed felt a strange pressure behind my eyes." She looked at Lord Ashworth, a fragile hope dawning in her exhausted features. "If there is even a sliver of a chance, my lord, to quiet this din, what would be the harm in trying?" Her gaze moved to her husband, an unspoken plea in her bloodshot eyes. Lord Blackwood, after another long-suffering pause, during which the beds roared their disapproval, finally conceded with a weary wave of his hand. "Very well. A folly. But a folly that perhaps, by some miracle, might grant me a moment of peace before I lose my mind entirely. What precisely do you propose?" Thus began a most peculiar and unprecedented undertaking. Lord Ashworth, despite his own spiraling exhaustion, became a whirlwind of desperate instruction, with the grudging assistance of Master Elms, who moved like a somnambulist through the ever-increasing noise, and the surprisingly eager cooperation of the servants, for whom the escalating cacophony was becoming unbearable. The word spread throughout Blackwood Castle. Every inhabitant, from the highest noble to the lowliest kitchen boy, was to prepare for a collective act of profound slumber. The air in the castle, already thick with the maddening symphony of squeaking, grew charged with a strange blend of cynicism, desperation, and a faint, almost fearful hope. Servants bustled, not with their usual quiet industry, but with a frantic, uncharacteristic energy, driven by the sheer overwhelming sound. They changed sheets, smoothed blankets, and prepared their own simple cots, all while the squeaking beds around them continued their relentless mocking chorus. Gareth, the cook, began preparing a vast quantity of warm milk, laced with every soporific herb he could find, his face a mask of grim determination. Barnaby, the stable master, ensured his horses were settled, then returned to his own small cot, muttering about the indignity of having to bargain with dead carpenters. Midge, the laundress, simply watched, her ancient eyes holding a profound, knowing melancholy, as if she had seen this play out many times before, in 1,000 variations of human futility. At precisely the stroke of midnight, a time that felt less like an hour and more like an eternal stretch of auditory torture, a signal was given. It was not a bell, for no bell could be heard over the din. It was a single, long, mournful blast from a hunting horn, held to the lips of a particularly brave, or particularly deaf, guard standing on the battlements, its sound utterly swallowed by the pervasive physical roar of the beds. But the inhabitants knew. This was the moment. One by one, in their separate chambers, in their distant corners of the castle, the residents of Blackwood lay down. Lord Ashworth, back in his own great four-poster, whose springs and frame now seemed to shriek with a personal infuriated protest, lay perfectly still. He closed his eyes, not with the hope of immediate sleep, but with a desperate, almost ritualistic intent. He imagined himself sinking, releasing, letting go of every tension, every worry, every thought. He heard the muffled sounds of Lord and Lady Blackwood settling into their own bed, which immediately began a new, furious sequence of creaks and groans. He heard the distant, collective sigh of the servants, a sound drowned out by the bedlam. He willed the quiet. He willed the peace. He willed the cessation of the impossible noise. And then, impossibly, it began. Not with a sudden dramatic silence, but with a slow, agonizingly gradual diminishment. The overwhelming wall of sound, which had been pressing in on Lord Ashworth for hours, began to subtly, infinitesimally recede. The sharp, metallic screeches from the north tower were the first to soften, their edges fraying, their intensity waning. Then it came, the rhythmic squeak, thud, squeak. Squire Edmund's chamber, which had been hammering at Ashworth's skull for what felt like an eternity, slowly, exquisitely began to fade, its rhythm breaking, its volume decreasing, until it was little more than a distant, intermittent whisper. A wave of profound, almost dizzying relief washed over Lord Ashworth. He lay perfectly still, holding his breath, listening to the impossible. The clamor from the kitchen wing, the high-pitched whine of the scullery maids' cots, softened, became less insistent, then ceased altogether. The deep, guttural, guide-teeth-thrum groan thrumming from the cellar, which had vibrated through the very foundations slowly, deliberately, began to lessen, its immense pressure easing, like a great, unseen hand releasing its grip. The silence was not sudden but profound in its arrival. It was a silence that unfolded slowly, like a vast, heavy curtain being drawn across a stage of madness. The individual squeaks, once so distinct and maddening, began to dissolve into the overall quiet. The symphony of torment broke down, piece by agonizing piece, until only a faint, Scattered collection of isolated sounds remain. A single distant bone creaking from the west wing, like a final weary sigh. A soft, almost polite chirpy from a bed in a forgotten guest chamber, as if bidding farewell. Each sound, though still present, was losing its malice, its intensity, its ability to grate upon the nerves. They became what they should have always been, the natural sounds of an old house settling, of ancient wood breathing. Lord Ashworth felt tears prick at his eyes, not of sorrow, but of sheer, overwhelming gratitude. The pressure in his head eased. His muscles, which had been knotted tight for hours, began to relax, a slow, blissful unfurling. He felt the soft caress of the cool linen against his cheek, the yielding comfort of the mattress beneath him, a comfort he had, until this moment, believed impossible within these cursed walls. The air, previously thick with the invisible vibrations of sound, now felt light, clean, and still. He took a long, deep, shuddering breath, a breath that felt like the first true breath he had taken in what felt like weeks. The silence grew, vast and encompassing. From every chamber in the castle, from the lord's opulent four-poster to the lowliest cot in the stables, the sounds ceased. A profound, almost sacred quiet settled over Blackwood, a quiet that had been a stranger to its halls for centuries. Lord Ashworth lay there, not daring to move, listening to the blessed absence of sound. He could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of his own heart, the soft, steady rhythm of his own breathing. He could hear, for the first time, the quiet, imperceptible sigh of the castle itself, a great, ancient structure finally, truly, sinking into a moment of collective repose. The air in his chamber felt cool, still, and utterly wonderfully empty of noise. Then, just as the last vestige of the terrible symphony faded into the profound quiet, just as Lord Ashworth felt the blissful, welcoming pull of true restorative sleep begin its gentle embrace, a single solitary sound pierced the stillness. It was faint, very faint, almost imperceptible, a delicate reedy squeak in party. It came from somewhere close, somewhere deep within his own bed, from the ancient wood itself, a final, lingering, almost affectionate complaint. It was not loud. It was not maddening. It was merely rain, a final whisper, perhaps of Thomas's enduring presence, perhaps of Blackwood's ancient memory, a gentle, ironic reminder that even a curse once woven so deeply leaves behind a single, subtle, unforgettable echo. And with that, Lord Ashworth, his mind finally truly quiet, allowed himself to drift, a profound peace settling over him, knowing that the long, long night of the castle's terrible, joyous silence had only just begun. Chapter 13. A morning of uneasy peace. Lord Ashworth awoke to silence. It was not the absolute, suffocating silence of the night's final, lingering squeak, but a silence nonetheless, a profound, almost sacred quietude that felt utterly alien within the ancient walls of Blackwood Castle. The first sensation was not sight, for the heavy velvet curtains of the four-poster still held his chamber in deep, if now benevolent, darkness. It was the absence of sound, a lack so complete it hummed like a forgotten song. His ears, which hours ago had been assailed by 1,000 tiny, maddening complaints, now registered only the soft, distant murmur of the morning wind stirring in the turrets, a gentle sigh that seemed to carry no malice. And then he felt it. The luxurious, blissful weight of true, deep sleep having finally embraced him. His muscles, which had been clenched for days, perhaps weeks, were loose and yielding. His head, which had throbbed with the rhythm of the castle's torment, felt clear, almost buoyant. He stretched, a long, languid movement that produced a soft, entirely natural creak from the bed beneath him, a sound devoid of the previous night's malevolence, merely the voice of old wood settling. It was a single, perfect, ordinary sound, and it brought a strange, almost tearful relief. He lay there for a long time, unwilling to break the spell. The memory of the night, of the spectral carpenter, Thomas, and his chilling confession, of the castle's collective ear-splitting scream, was sharp and vivid, but it felt distant, like a nightmare recalled in the comfort of a warm bed. And indeed he was in a warm bed, a bed that had, against all logic and the weight of centuries, finally yielded to its proper purpose. The profound peace was almost overwhelming, a sensory experience in itself after the relentless auditory assault. He closed his eyes again, not to force sleep, but to savor the quiet, to impress upon his memory the sensation of a mind at rest, a body unburdened by vigilance. Eventually, a faint, silvery light began to seep around the edges of the heavy curtains, indicating the slow, hesitant arrival of dawn. Lord Ashworth, with a renewed sense of purpose, sat up. The bed did not squeak with malice, merely with a gentle groan of wood disturbed. He swung his legs over the side, his bare feet meeting the cold flagstones with a familiar jolt. But this time the cold felt invigorating, not chilling. He stood, testing his limbs. He felt rested, truly, profoundly rested. It was a sensation so novel, so luxurious after weeks of travel and a night of unspeakable torment, that it bordered on the miraculous. His eyes, though still carrying faint shadows from the cumulative exhaustion of his life, were clearer, brighter, alert, in a way they hadn't been since before he'd embarked on this tedious journey. He moved to the window, pulling back the heavy, dust-laden velvet curtains. The world outside was bathed in the pale, ethereal light of early morning. A thin mist clung to the craggy peaks surrounding the castle, softening their harsh outlines. The sky was a delicate, bruised purple, slowly bleeding into a watery gray, promising another day of typical Blackwood weather. But it was not the sight that caught him, but the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The pervasive physical roar of the beds had vanished, replaced by the gentle, natural sounds of a castle awakening, the distant crow of a rooster, the faint clatter of a pot from the kitchens below, the muffled lowing of cattle from the stables. The castle still hummed, perhaps, with a residual memory of its long torment. But it was a quiet hum, a gentle thrum that spoke of life, not relentless, maddening friction. Lord Ashworth dressed quickly, his movements precise and unhurried, a stark contrast to his clumsy, desperate efforts of the night before. He buckled his sword belt, the familiar weight a comforting presence. His mind, now clear, began to consider the implications of the night's events. The bargain with Thomas the carpenter, the promise of atonement, of reparations, of a sanctuary for Silas. These were not the fleeting delusions of a sleep-deprived mind. They were a clear, undeniable mandate. He would ensure they were carried out. Stepping out into the corridor, he was met not by silence, but by a quiet symphony of natural sounds. The squeaks were gone, truly gone. He listened intently, straining his ears, half expecting a faint, mocking echo. But there was nothing. Only the gentle whisper of the wind through cracks in the stone, the subtle drip of moisture somewhere deep within the walls, and the distant, almost muffled sounds of daily life beginning. He proceeded towards the great hall, a strange lightness in his step, a sense of quiet triumph mixed with a deep, lingering awe. As he descended the main staircase, he began to encounter the castle's other occupants. Master Elms, the steward, was emerging from a side passage, carrying a ledger. His usual stoop seemed less pronounced, and while his face still bore the marks of chronic weariness, his eyes, previously dull and glazed, held a faint, almost bewildered sparkle. He looked at Lord Ashworth, blinked once, then twice, as if seeing him for the first time. "My lord." Elms sighed, his voice, usually a dry rustle, now possessed a hint of something resembling actual inflection. A remarkable morning, is it not? I cannot recall a silence such as this since before I was born. There was a faint, almost hesitant smile playing on his lips, a truly unprecedented sight on the steward's face. He then looked down at his ledger, as if suddenly realizing he was supposed to be doing something productive. Lord Ashworth simply nodded, a profound sense of shared understanding passing between them. The transformation, though subtle, was undeniable. The pervasive pallor, the glazed eyes, the slow, deliberate movements that had characterized the castle's inhabitants were still present, a testament to generations of sleeplessness. But now, beneath it all, was a fragile, nascent peace. In the great hall, Lord and Lady Blackwood were already seated at the long polished table, partaking of a simple breakfast of gruel and cold bread. The enormous room, which had been a crucible of sound hours ago, was now hushed. Lord Blackwood, who had gone to bed a man on the brink of sanity, now sat a little straighter, his heavy-lidded eyes still shadowed, but with a surprising clarity. Lady Isolde beside him had a faint blush on her cheeks, and for the first time, Lord Ashworth noticed the subtle curve of a smile playing on her lips. Their bed, the ancestral four-poster, was a vast, silent presence in their private chamber, its tormenting voice finally still. Lord Ashworth, refreshed, but still bearing the memory of the night's horrors, inclined his head. "My lords, my lady, a peaceful morning." Lord Blackwood looked up, and for the first time since their arrival truly met Lord Ashworth's gaze. "Peace indeed, my lord," he said, his voice a low, rumbling marvel. "I confess I slept. Not for hours perhaps, but for a solid, unbroken stretch of time. It was unprecedented, like a dream I had forgotten how to have." He looked at his wife, a shared, silent wonder passing between them. "And the sounds, they are gone. All but the gentle settling of the old house." Lady Isolde sighed, a sound of profound contentment. "It was a miracle, Lord Ashworth. A true miracle. My mind feels lighter. My very soul feels as though it has been granted a respite it had long forgotten." She paused, then looked at him with an intensity that pierced his well-earned composure. "You truly spoke to a ghost, then? You truly brokered a peace with the long dead?" Lord Ashworth merely nodded, a wry smile touching his lips. "It appears so, my lady. Or perhaps the castle simply grew tired of its own screaming. Either way, the silence is a blessing." He did not elaborate on the specific details of the bargain, the promises of atonement and a sanctuary for Silas. Those were matters for him to pursue, not to boast about. He knew the path ahead would be long and arduous, full of skeptical nobles and legal complexities, but the profound quiet of the castle fueled his resolve. He ate sparingly, a quiet strength returning to him with each mouthful. The servants moved about the great hall with a newfound, if still weary, grace towards. He saw Midge, the laundress, passing by, her ancient eyes meeting his. She gave him a slow, subtle nod, a silent acknowledgment of the impossible task achieved. She still looked perpetually tired, a lifetime of Blackwood's curse etched into her features, but there was a quiet dignity, a profound sense of relief that had replaced the former grim resignation. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, pale shafts of light through the narrow windows, Lord Ashworth made his preparations to depart. His horse, Beatrice, seemed to share in the castle's newfound calm, standing patiently in the courtyard, her head held a little higher. He paid his respects to Lord and Lady Blackwood, assuring them he would pursue the matters of the ghost's bargain with utmost diligence. Lord Blackwood, still somewhat bewildered but profoundly grateful, offered him letters of introduction and generous provisions for his journey. Lady Isolde pressed a small, intricately carved wooden charm into his hand, a token of her sincere gratitude. He mounted Beatrice, the familiar creak of the saddle, a welcome sound this time. As he rode out of the castle courtyard, the enormous oak gates closing slowly behind him, he turned for one last look at Castle Blackwood. It stood grim and grey against the clearing sky, still a sprawling stone mollusk clinging to the rock face. But it felt different now. Less oppressive, less burdened. The air around it, though still carrying the scent of damp stone and ancient dust, felt lighter, as if a great, unseen weight had been lifted. He would of course forever be haunted by the night's events. The memory of the collective scream of the beds, the spectral visage of Thomas, the chilling confession of a curse woven by denied rest, these would undoubtedly linger in his mind, surfacing in the quiet hours of his own nights. He would likely find himself, for years to come, listening intently to the natural creaks and groans of any bed he lay upon, always half expecting a familiar, malevolent squeak. He might even develop a nervous twitch when confronted with overly vigorous mattress springs. The irony, he reflected with a faint, dry smile, was that a journey ostensibly about sheep grazing rights had led him to a confrontation with spectral carpenters and sentient furniture, a profound lesson in the unexpected horrors of the truly mundane. He would carry the ghost of Blackwood's clamor within him, a permanent, internal echo of a night when sleep itself had become a weapon. But as he rode away, leaving the silent castle behind, he also carried something else. The profound, almost dizzying relief of a silence earned, a peace, however uneasy, finally, gloriously found. And for the first time in weeks, Lord Ashworth found himself looking forward, not merely to reaching his next destination, but to the simple, uncomplicated prospect of a truly quiet, ordinary night's rest. A luxury he now understood to be more precious than any treaty or noble title. Chapter 14. The legend lives on. Lord Ashworth rode away from Castle Blackwood, leaving the vast grey edifice behind him, a profound silence echoing not only from its ancient stones, but also, strangely, from within his own skull. The previous night's auditory torment, the collective deafening scream of 1,000 beds, had been a physical assault, a relentless clamor that had driven him to the very precipice of sanity. Now, bathed in the pale, hesitant light of dawn, the absence of that sound was a tangible blessing, a quiet so profound it felt like a newfound luxury. He carried with him the distinct memory of the single, last, lingering squeak from his own bed, a faint, reedy whisper that served as an almost affectionate farewell, a subtle, ironic reminder of the curse that had been woven, and perhaps imperfectly unwoven. The weight of his promise to the ghostly carpenter, Thomas, settled upon his shoulders with the solid reality of the morning light. Atonement, dis dia, Reims, Indelizer, a sanctuary for young Silas. These were not the vaporous dreams of a sleep-starved mind, but concrete tasks demanding immediate, rigorous attention in the waking world. His first port of call, after concluding his utterly mundane negotiations regarding sheep grazing rights, a task that now seemed laughably trivial in comparison to his nocturnal adventures, was the Royal Chancery. Here, Lord Ashworth, accustomed to the polite skepticism of bureaucrats, found himself navigating a new, more profound, and utterly bewildering form of disbelief, explaining the need for a royal decree acknowledging the historical injustice against a long-dead carpenter and his apprentice, at the hands of an even longer-dead lord, and then the necessity of establishing a public memorial dedicated to the sanctity of rest, all due to a curse laid upon beds that squeak, proved to be a singular challenge. The royal clerks, men of parchment and quill, accustomed to matters of land, lineage, and taxation, stared at him with expressions ranging from polite bewilderment to thinly veiled concern for his mental faculties. He spoke of vengeful spirits, of collective insomnia, of beds that screamed, and they, in turn, spoke of disturbances of the humors and the regrettable effects of prolonged travel. Yet Lord Ashworth, fueled by the memory of the clamor and the quiet of Blackwood, was unyielding. He invoked his own noble standing, his unblemished reputation, and eventually the sheer, relentless force of his own clear-eyed conviction. He presented the case not as a supernatural occurrence, but as a historical injustice requiring symbolic redress to bring peace to a troubled region, a strategically vague but compelling argument that surprisingly resonated with the court's desire for public order and the perception of fair governance. It took years, not months, but eventually a royal decree was issued, acknowledging the peculiar hardships faced by craftsmen in the distant past and establishing a small endowment-funded house of quietude in the village of Oakhaven, dedicated to the memory of all honest laborers denied their rightful repose. It was a humble, almost embarrassingly modest building, designed for travelers seeking a single truly undisturbed night's rest. Its timbers sourced from the quietest forests, its mattresses stuffed with the softest goose down, and a small, unadorned stone tablet in its garden bearing a simple inscription, "For Silas may his rest be eternal." The ghost of Thomas, he knew, would likely find the house of quietude a rather paltry atonement for centuries of suffering, but it was a start. It was a tangible act of turning the tide of historical indifference. Back at Blackwood Castle, the immediate effect of the collective sleep was nothing short of miraculous, if bewildering. The pervasive silence held. The Blackwood family, Lord Alaric and Lady Isolde, accustomed to their centuries-old burden of chronic wakefulness, found themselves experiencing something akin to genuine slumber, often waking with a profound, almost disoriented sense of peace. Their eyes, once perpetually shadowed, began to lose some of their haunted depth. Their conversations, which had invariably circled back to the topic of sleep, its absence, its tantalizing promise, its utter impossibility, now drifted to matters of estate management, the weather, and surprisingly the faint, comforting chirping of birds outside their window, sounds they had previously never truly registered above the internal clamor of their ancestral bed. The servants, too, benefited. Old Midge, the laundress, was observed on occasion to actually yawning with genuine tiredness, rather than the resigned, almost mechanical exhalations of prior nights. Her hands, which had polished the same spoon for what felt like an eternity, now moved with a new efficiency, completing tasks in a fraction of the time, leaving her with the unprecedented luxury of actual, undisturbed rest in her small, quiet cot. Gareth, the cook, no longer prepared midnight gruel for his own weary consumption. Instead, found himself rising at a more respectable hour, his culinary creativity surprisingly enhanced by the unfamiliar sensation of a full night's repose. Barnaby, the stable-master, found that even his horses seemed calmer, no longer agitated by the castle's unseen vibrations, and he too enjoyed the simple pleasure of not having to groom them in the dead of night out of sheer, unyielding wakefulness. Yet this peace, this newfound quiet, was always Uneasy. It was a peace born of a supernatural bargain, a silence that felt perpetually on the verge of fracturing. The castle itself, though no longer actively screaming, retained a subtle underlying current of watchful stillness. The air still carried the faint, earthy scent of ancient stone and the unspoken history of denied rest. The residents of Blackwood never entirely shed their deeply ingrained habits of vigilance. They still moved with a quiet deliberation, listened with a heightened awareness to the settling groans of the old timbers, and often found themselves, even in the deepest slumber, waking with a sudden, inexplicable jolt, convinced for a fleeting moment that they had heard the phantom squeak of a bed that wasn't there. The one last, lingering squeak Lord Ashworth had heard before drifting off, a mere whisper of friction, was a subtle echo in the castle's new tranquility, a reminder that some wounds, however healed, leave a faint, permanent scar. And then there was the legend. Lord Ashworth, a man of noble standing and impeccable honesty, found himself, perhaps against his better judgment, sharing the tale of Blackwood. Not loudly, not boastfully, but in hushed tones over crackling fires in distant inns, or during long, contemplative evenings with fellow lords. He spoke of the castle's ancient curse, of the ghost of the carpenter, Thomas, and the night the beds screamed. His account, earnest and delivered with the quiet gravitas of a man who had truly endured the unbearable, carried a peculiar power. The story, as such tales are wont to do, spread. It traveled from village to village, from market square to bustling city. Each retelling added its own embellishments, its own local flavor. The ghostly carpenter became a hulking, spectral figure, constantly hammering on invisible wood. The squeaking beds transformed from an insidious psychological torment into giant carnivorous pieces of furniture that gnashed their teeth. The House of Quietude in Oak Haven, intended as a beacon of peace, became, in the popular imagination, a morbid curiosity, a strange pilgrimage site for those who wished to sleep on cursed ground, usually with disappointing, ordinary results. The result was an ironic twist to Blackwood's long history. Even with the immediate curse seemingly lifted, the castle's reputation for sleeplessness not only persisted but flourished, fueled by the very story of its temporary cure. Visitors who arrived at Blackwood in the years that followed would come with a palpable sense of apprehension. They had heard the whispers, the exaggerated tales, the knowing glances. And thus, a peculiar self-fulfilling prophecy took root. Guests, shown to their chambers, would eye the majestic four-poster beds with a mixture of awe and acute suspicion. They would gingerly test the mattresses, half expecting a sudden shriek. They would lie down, listening intently, convinced that any faint, natural creak of the ancient building was the precursor to the terrifying chorus. The silence, when it came, felt unnerving. A profound void seemed to hum with unseen, unheard potential. Their minds, primed by the pervasive legend, would then fill that silence with imagined sounds, a distant, reedy squeaky that wasn't there, a faint, rhythmic kampum that was merely their own heart beating against the pillow, a subtle ingroan that was nothing more than the settling of their own tired bones. They would twist and turn, not from any actual noise, but from the expectation of noise. Their ears, strained to catch the phantom complaints, would become hyper-aware, amplifying every rustle of the heavy curtains, every drip of water in the distant plumbing, every whisper of the wind through the chimneys. The luxurious, soft mattresses would feel strangely hard, the crisp sheets unexpectedly abrasive. The profound sense of peace that Lord Ashworth had experienced on his departure was rarely, if ever, found by Blackwood's subsequent guests. They would rise the next morning, not from a night of active torment, but from a night of self-inflicted anticipatory insomnia. Their eyes would be shadowed, their faces pale, their expressions holding that same peculiar, distant glaze that had characterized generations of Blackwood's inhabitants. They would depart, much like their predecessors, sighing with relief, proclaiming Blackwood to be indeed the castle of the 1,000 sleepless nights, not because of an active curse, but because of the pervasive psychological weight of its infamous story. Lord Ashworth, in his later years, would sometimes receive letters from Lord Blackwood, often accompanied by surprisingly plump pheasants or rich wines. The letters, penned in Lord Blackwood's increasingly steady hand, would often include a brief, dry remark. "The quiet holds, my lord. Though the servants still complain of phantom whispers, and our guests continue to arrive looking as though they expect their beds to argue with them." A subtle humor, born of centuries of shared suffering, had finally settled over the Blackwood line. The legend of Castle Blackwood, therefore, lived on, not as a tale of active haunting, but as a far more insidious psychological torment. It became a testament to the enduring power of a story, a chilling reminder that some curses, once deeply woven into the fabric of a place, can transform, adapt, and persist in the human mind, ensuring that even in silence, the memory of a terrifying, Unified Squeak would forever prevent anyone from truly sleeping soundly within its ancient, venerable, and now quietly infamous walls.